Good evening. Welcome to our Silicon Valley Clean Energy December Board of Directors meeting. I would like to call the meeting to order at about 7:03. And do I need to bring this? Director Gibbons is attending by teleconference?
Yes,
Is that right?
correct.
Great. We will hear from her soon, I'm sure. So we will start with the roll call.
Yes, thank you. Good evening, Chair Abakoga.
Here.
Vice Chair Miller.
Here.
Director Elahi. Director Sayok.
Here.
Director Smith.
Here.
Director Sinks.
Here.
Director Corrigan.
Here.
Alternate Director Flagger. Director Ellenberg. Thank you. Participating by phone, Director Gibbons, are you on the line?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And I will note that Director Martinez Beltran, Director Tovar, and Director Montano are currently absent.
Great, thank you. We will move on to public comment on matters not listed on the agenda. The public may provide comments on any item not on the agenda. Speakers are limited to 3 minutes each. Do we have any members of the public wishing to speak on a non-agendized item? No, if not, great. We'll move on to the consent calendar. Are there any members of the board wishing to pull an item or speak to an item? No. Director Gibbons, would you like to pull or comment on any of the consent items?
Thank you. Everything is fine.
Great, thank you. So this requires a roll call. So is there a motion to approve the consent calendar?
So moved.
Motion by Director Ellenberg, seconded by Director Smith. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Are there any members of the public wishing to comment on any of the consent calendar items? I don't see anyone, so motion by Director Ellenberg, second by Director Smith. Any other discussion? We'll do a roll call vote, please.
Elahi. Director Sayok.
Yes.
Director Smith.
Yes.
Director Sinks. Director Corrigan.
Yes.
Chair Abakoga.
Aye.
Vice Chair Miller.
Aye.
Alternate Director Flagger.
Yes.
Director Ellenberg.
Yes.
Director Gibbons.
Yes.
Thank you. The motion carries.
Great, thank you. We now move on to the regular calendar. And before we go through the items, I wanted to note that item number 9, regarding the authorization of the CEO to negotiate and execute an office lease agreement, this item will be taken up after the closed session. So we'll go through items 2 through 8 and then board member announcements, then go into closed session, and we'll come back out to take a vote on item 9. So with that, we'll move through to go to item 2, the CEO report. And we have our CEO, Girish Balachandran.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair
Thank you.
Abakoga, members of the board. The CEO report, we have 2 new employees, but unfortunately they couldn't make it here tonight due to children issues. However, they'll be here at a future meeting and we will introduce them to you. But we do have Zoe Elizabeth is working in Don Bray's group. And we have Kevin Armstrong, our Administrative Services Manager, who will be working in Don Eckert's group. Additionally, in the CEO report, I have provided you an update on PG&E restructuring, and you have been also updated via Mayor Licado's emails, but we've attached over here some information around the principles for a customer-owned utility. We'll be updating you in closed session about some recent developments in bankruptcy court that have occurred since we wrote this report. But essentially, PG&E's bankruptcy, in PG&E's bankruptcy, PG&E's plan has ascended to the most favorable plan right now. And the governor will have to decide whether he likes the plan or not, as per Assembly Bill AB 1054, which by law he has to decide whether this plan will work or not, and he has to make that decision on Friday. Some of the issues related to SVCE and how we are going to continue to participate in this case we will talk to you in closed session later tonight. I'd also like to bring your attention to the rates update. We had a blurb over here, but I'd like to have Don Eckert go through that. But before Don starts that, I'd like to have Hillary Staver is going to give you a legislative and regulatory update, after which we have a short presentation that Don will give you on rates. Thank you, Hillary.
Good evening. It is that festive time of year when we wrap up rate setting. It's the best season. So that is, as Girish mentioned, that's really the biggest item this month. Is we're nearing some clarity on what our rates are going to be in the PCIA next year. So I'll leave that to Don, but we do have a couple other things this month. Just today at the California Energy Commission, we finally wrapped up the proceeding for creating the regulations for implementing AB 1110. So this is something, I think, for us internally, we've had an eye on this and been planning for it for quite some time. We've been talking about phasing out PCC2 renewables, for example. So there's really nothing content-wise that this changes for us, but it is now formally part of the regulations. And one change to note, due partially to the length of time it took to implement these regulations. We've been working on developing them for over a year now. The final version did push implementation back 1 year. So originally, the power content label that we send out once a year to our customers detailing the composition of our portfolio was supposed to start showing GHG intensity in the label that we send out in June 2020 for the 2019 portfolio. That's now been pushed back 1 year. So it'll start with the 2021 power content label that talks about the 2020 resources, because we had been approaching a point where there was not going to be time basically for LSEs to respond to the new regulations if they kept the original timeline. So that's now wrapped up, and as I said, we've been planning for that for a while. We're also continuing on the IRP development. As you can see, we have a conversation on the agenda tonight about the allocation process for GHG-free resources. Yeah, for those of you who participated in the workshop, that's a big contributor to the planning that we're doing on IRP. And we also now have the draft reference system plan, the sort of statewide standard that the Commission has put together, released, so we can incorporate that into our process as well. And we're still waiting on the decision on resource adequacy, the central buyer structure. So likely at this point, it'll be early 2020 when that comes out. And we're waiting on a ruling that will kick off the direct access study on the potential to expand direct access across the state for non-residential customers. So we have a couple things that are running a little later than we expected and likely will kick in early 2020 now, unless we get an end of the year surprise. So that's regulatory. On the legislative side, the main thing I'll say is we are going around talking to our legislators in the districts while everybody is still here before recess ends. So thank you to those of you on the Legislative Ad Hoc Committee who are helping us cover those. So I think those are the main things, and I will turn it over. I'll leave it to Don to dive a little bit more into the rate setting. Any questions?
Dr. Ellenberg, did you have a question for CEO or for?
I actually just had a comment that goes back to the very, very first thing that you said, Girish, that your 2 new employees have children issues. I'm going to assume that that meant child care issues and not issues with their children.
That's correct. Yes.
And just want to note, entirely off topic for this board, but something that I am working on countywide and hope to include all of the business community in, is to think about offering childcare on site, whether during the day or in evening meetings, so that we don't have this challenge of parents having to miss or be left out of work because they don't have adequate childcare options.
Thank you very much.
You are very welcome.
Thank you.
So are we going to Mr. Don?
Can I ask a question about the CEO report, or do you want to take them at the end?
We're still on the CEO report on
Okay.
rates.
All right.
So Don is going to go through a presentation on rates and PCIA
Okay.
that we teed up by text, but we have a little bit more detail.
Yeah, I had a
that we'd like
question
to-
about what you'd said earlier, but I'm happy to hold till the end.
Okay.
Well, good evening, fellow directors and Madam Chair. If your expectation was that they would never invite the Finance Department to speak during the holiday season unless it was bad news, I shall not disappoint. So we're going to talk about PCIA and rates and updates of what we're looking at over the next few months. So I do feel like the finance director that cried wolf regarding rates. It seems like every year I say the sky is falling with PG&E rates as well as the PCIA, and luckily have been proved wrong. This time, though, it seems a little different. We have some math behind the numbers. We'll go over very briefly on all the assumptions that have led to a significant under-recovery on the current PCI rate. We'll also briefly cover what we call a cap in the last proposed decision that was supposed to provide some stability in that PCIA increase year over year, and how the cap actually may not be a cap. And we'll also spend a slide talking about what SVCE's response will be, as well as CalCCA's. And I imagine all of you over the next 2 to 3 months will be asked to participate in that discussion as well. So based on what we know today, I suspect over the next 3 to 6 months, we'll be talking about rates quite a bit. Our expectation as of today, I don't have anything in writing yet, but our expectation as of today is that our PG&E generation rates are going to go down January 1st by roughly 6%. Now, you may recall that our current rates are set at a 4% discount to PG&E. So if that happens on January 1, then until we change rates, we'll be approximately 2% higher than PG&E. We expect then in March that there'll be another adjustment as part of the rate setting process with PG&E, that those generation rates that drop 6% will probably increase another 2 to 3%. So we think we'll land in that 3 to 4% drop compared to where we are today with PG&E rates. But we also, and we'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide, we're also severely under-recovered on the PCIA. So if we incorporate the cap, which is a ½ cent, you would see a 20% increase in the PCIA, and we expect that in the late February, March timeframe. Once we know where we think the final rates changes for generation will happen in February, March, and we know what that PCIA adjustment is going to be, we would come back to you in either March with a discussion for April implementation of a rates response. Then in May, there could be this, what we call a trigger effect with the PCIA increase. That could be another 60% increase in the PCIA. If that were to happen in May, we will be soon back to the board on our response to that as well. So look for rates or rates discussion over the next 6 months of 2020. I won't go through the list of items here that are influencing this under collection with the PCIA, but suffice it to say that almost every assumption that PG&E made when they set the PCI rate is wrong. So it's led to a severe under collection in the PCIA, something that couldn't be made up with just the cap, which then leads us to a discussion of, do we really have a cap? So there is regulatory language where the PG&E projects that in Q1 of next year, there will be a 10% shortfall between actual revenue collection and the forecasted amount. So the cap isn't recovering that under collection fast enough. PG&E then could come back as soon as May 1st and remove the cap and increase the PCIA by 2 cents per kWh. Just to put some numbers behind that, if that were to happen, the PCIA would be 80% higher than what it is today. And for the residential PCIA rate, would be close to 5 cents per kWh. To put that in perspective, our power supply costs are around 6 cents per kWh. So the PCIA would almost be as high as our power supply cost. And due to the amount of under collection, we suspect that whatever change is made to the PCIA, would stay with us for over a year. Give you an idea of what those budget impacts would be with the numbers that we're showing tonight. Just the cap itself, 21% increase weighted average for SVCE. That's $16 million in reduced revenues and reduced surplus. If the trigger were to happen, look for an additional $30 million reduction in revenues. All in, we have this over the course of 12 months. That's a $40 to $50 million impact to our bottom line, with just the additional PCIA, not including what we currently already have. Our response, and this is fluid, the plan's being developed as we meet here tonight, but CalCCA filed comments a few days ago outlining the reasons why the forecast is incorrect and that the results should be lower. If the trigger application is filed by PG&E, CalCCA will argue that a trigger defeats the concept of rate stability. That makes sense. We'll also probably be soliciting media and legislative support, and suspect we'll be reaching out to this elected body officials as well for support. And it also then fuels a further discussion on long-term solutions, such as let's look at something that all the CCAs could be part of as well, such as prepaying this PCIA, pay a lump sum fee up front, have to work out what that amount is, and get this off our books. But that's a longer-term solution that's going to take some time to formulate. But certainly with these recent developments, it's put some renewed fuel into that discussion. So with that, happy holidays. And that's our update on the challenges we're having on rates with the PCIA, and it then fuels then other mitigation strategies that we'll present to you later tonight on reducing cost.
If I may just add to what Don said, we'll be back to you in January, February, and March with updates as we get to know more. So either the CEO report or, as you saw on the timeline, we'll have a separate presentation just dealing with rates at future meetings.
Any questions on this item?
Yeah, so the with this kind of a PCI increase, it sounds like we could sustain this hit for a year, honestly, if it came all at once. Is that correct?
So currently we have a $50 million surplus. We could sustain
We
this
could
for-
burn money.
Yes.
I'm concerned about the other CCAs in the community that may not be in the same.
I don't think we even
financial
have to
position.
burn money. I think we just have no reserves. But they're not people doing what we're doing.
It just seems to me like we have to redouble our efforts to ask for transparency. The fact that this PCIA can, go up 20% one year, 25%, it really it speaks to some real issues. And I understand from having talked to Girish about this ahead of time that 40% of it has to do with fluctuating electricity, the market, wholesale market. But this really is unacceptable. And that gets to the first point that I wanted to make, which is the governor has an opportunity Friday to ratify this agreement or say, you know what? This is former PUC President Loretta Lynch leading a coalition, and I quote, "It is time for California to take over PG&E and stop letting profit stand in the way of a safe, clean electricity future we all need and deserve." Now, the governor spoke a lot of harsh words during the wildfires and the PSPSs and all. I sure hope that he really understands what's been going on here. We, as ratepayers in this state, have covered PG&E's bottom side over and over and over again. If the governor lets them escape, it's hard to believe that his words, his anger, and his thought in actually moving us toward a sustainable future a couple of months ago was sincere, right? So I really think that we need a different ownership model, and I would hope that the governor would consider the dynamic of the last 2 years and say, wait a minute, this is not the correct alignment of interests that we need if we do want a grid that'll be fixed and reliable going forward. Clearly, right, we hear promises from PG&E over and over again, and they fail to deliver. And I think fundamentally it's not because they're bad people. The PUC aren't bad people, but we have great inefficiency in regulation of this monopoly. And it's pretty clear the PUC isn't up to the task. And it's pretty clear that the alignment of motives doesn't yield the right solution for all of us. We need reliable power that's on, and we need to have a governor that's going to stand behind making the change happen that we need, and not 5-10 years from now see him back in bankruptcy court again, having bailed him out this time and then needing another one. I don't know what the governor's going to do, frankly, next fall if we have yet more PSPSs. We can't keep doing this to ourselves. Thanks.
Dr. Corrigan?
Don, can you put the roadmap back up that you crafted? The snowy ice mountain. What was that? What was that? I'm just wondering if we have any historical data on PG&E in the past. Do they have a history of doing this kind of volatile rate increases in a 30-day period or 60-day period, 90-day period? In the 2 years I've sat up here, I know we've had this conversation about this time every winter and thought, oh my gosh, here it comes. And then sort of sigh of relief in February, March when we realized, okay, it's not as bad as we thought, or in some cases it lasted all the way till June before they actually got it situated. Is there really a reason to believe that PG&E would do this to ratepayers where they're going to jack the rates in a 90-day period significantly like this?
Yes.
Wow.
So this-
why?
So
Go ahead.
the CPUC has certain procedural rules as to what gets done when. PG&E doesn't have a choice but to file their data the best that they can, and we believe that the data that they filed, some of it's correct, some of it's not correct. So this is just part of this process. So I think that last slide that we had as to what we can do, so going through the regulatory process, right now we are saying the amount we think is incorrect, we think it needs to be reduced. The next step is going to be, we're going to ask for a petition for modification of this decision from back in fall 2018, which set this up. And like many of our regulators' rules, unintended consequences were not foreseen at that time. And that's the essence of what we see here. I think the point that Board Member Sinks made just before about transparency is a big deal. At CalCCA, we are discussing this, and so you see what actions we're going to take. But as far as the forecast, if the numbers turn out to be what the numbers are, and this is what we'll get hit with.
I agree, but I feel like it, I guess my knee-jerk response to this is that we have an obligation to our customers to communicate what's going on and to forecast in ways that protects our customers from this kind of volatility if we can.
Yes.
And so I do hope that our messaging team is looking at, what we need to put online, what we need
Right.
to communicate to our customers,
Right. So-
assuring them that we're watching as carefully as we can and we're going to take every step we can to make sure.
This is a lot of inside baseball stuff.
Sure.
So when you hear things like 80%, is it going to impact us? Definitely. But for our 270,000 customers, given the financial situation we are in, we'll be fine for the next 12 to 18 months. And this PCIA will settle down going the opposite direction year 3. And this is one of the things we are asking for, which is rate smoothing.
Right.
It's kind of like, for example, the analogy would be, what if CalPERS sent each of our cities a bill based on the stock market performance in that year? They don't do that. They do rate smoothing. That's essentially what PG&E is doing. They're pushing all the changes through in 1 year.
In 90 days.
Well, it starts in 90 days, but you pay for it over a 12 to 18-month period. And that's one of the things. If we have to pay it, we'll pay it, but give us some time to actually plan for this. So all your points about being able to forecast it and plan for it, we're going to have some ex parte meetings that have been scheduled for this coming week with commissioners up in San Francisco. We'll have our staff, other CCA staff, and Cal CCA staff at those meetings. So obviously we want to inform you in as close to real time as possible. And so these are the numbers we have right now. But our customers are going to be okay because we have enough reserves and the net revenue will get cut significantly. But with our reserves, our rates, I feel quite confident we'll be able to go through at least the next several years, continuing to have a discount with PG&E. Maybe it's not going to be 4%. Maybe we'll go back to 1% like we were a few years ago. We'll be fine for the next few years. Again, the point being, some other CCAs are not going to be in the same situation as we are.
Thank you.
Director Elahi?
As I understand it, PCIA is the difference between the actual cost of generation for the PG&E and the market value or whatever they're
Correct.
generating. So has anything gone up except the cost of filing bankruptcy? Or are there other items, has the market value of these products gone up?
Actually, the market value of power has come down, and therefore the cost that they recover from us goes up.
Okay.
So it's an inverse correlation. So when market prices go down, they collect more in the PCIA. So about 40% of the $611 million under collection is due to lower market prices last year. Some of the other issues about what other costs have gone up, this is part of what we have said. We don't think all their costs have gone up as much as what they've said. And that's part of, we ask for that kind of information in the regulatory process with the PUC.
Okay.
And I go back to this point about transparency of costs. It's very difficult to get this kind of data from PG&E in an easy and, should I say, prompt manner. Everything, and because there's not a culture of transparency around data.
And there's no independent way of getting that data?
Well, the PUC, the regulators basically are the referee, and they're the ones who will be overseeing those costs and looking into those costs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you have other items?
No, thank you.
That's
This
it.
is the end of
Okay.
my report. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Now that we're all cheered up.
Yes, on that happy note, are there any members of the public wishing to comment on the CEO's report? Any other discussion of the board? Yes, Vice Chair.
Just the general comment that I always try to make. PG&E is not necessarily our friends or acting in our best interests. And I believe with some of these dramatic whiplashes in forecasting, we went through this same kind of stuff in the past. The problem is you can never assume that it's going to land in our favor. And I believe that it is in their best interest to look like total goofballs and come up with all these random numbers until the music finally stops. Our organization is very fiscally sound. What we will be giving up is contributions to our reserves. We will not have to spend money in the bank to weather this at all. But we're in very unique and very strong financial position. And some of our brother and sister CCAs are not in this position. And these sorts of shenanigans could literally kill the whole CCA movement in the state of California. And so we cannot accept it. even though we know that we may be safe. And I know that we're all working hard, but we need to make sure that our legislature understands this is not PG&E making a little bit of extra money. This is a business practice that's destroying a movement that's actually achieving the goals that the state has stated.
Great. Thank you. We will move on now to the item 3, the adoption of a resolution on PG&E energy confirmation. And we have presenters Monica Padilla, Director of Power Resources, and Ian. Welcome.
Good evening, directors and Chairperson Abe Koga. So I also have with me Ian Williams, who actually put together much of the staff report and has been working really hard with folks at other CCAs and Punam as well, who you all know, on trying to get this to work for us. So before I start, I just want to note that since we issued the staff report, we had a little bit of change in thinking in terms of what our recommendation is. So the recommendation that we provide for you in the staff report, what we're going to offer today in the form of a presentation, is an alternative. And a lot of this is being driven because of some of the stuff that we just talked about, the PCIA and the pressure on our margins. And so we were tasked with, how can we improve that situation? Well, one thing that we can definitely do is look to see on how we can minimize costs and the cost of achieving carbon-free for our customers. So that's why we undertook the analysis kind of last minute and then provided this revised recommendation for your consideration. So just quickly, this is what we hope to cover tonight. Talk a little bit about our portfolio mix, that is our carbon-free portfolio mix. The recommendation that we're offering are alternatives. Some background about the cost allocation, the carbon-free allocation from PG&E. Some alternative scenarios, some portfolio mix strategies, process that the CPUC, that the PG&E has to go through to get this approved, and some next steps. So again, for your consideration, we offer you several alternatives. I wanted to rename this staff report the ifs, ands, or no buts proposal, because there's a lot of that in there. There's a lot of if this happens, then this or that. But basically, our revised recommendation is to still accept the full allocation that PG&E is offering for calendar year 2020. And that full allocation, again, is free, and it would include all of our pro rata share of their carbon-free resources, which are both large hydroelectric resources and nuclear coming from the Diablo Canyon facility. And then if you accept that, then you have a choice about what our portfolio mix would be, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go through this presentation. But if you decide to leave our carbon-free mix for our Green Start program, again, this does not impact our Green Prime. Green Prime is 100% renewable resource mix, and so we're only talking about Green Start. And under all the scenarios that we're looking at and all the different strategies that we've proposed, alternatives, we're always going to maintain 100% carbon-free for the Green Start program as well. But if the board decides to stay on path with trying to achieve a mix for our Green Start program, which is essentially 50% RPS or eligible renewables and 50% carbon-free non-RPS resources, then we propose that in the event that we are surplus carbon-free resources, which we will likely be, then we sell off hydroelectricity and include nuclear energy on our power content label. Or if you decide to go to kind of what we call the minimum compliant standard for RPS, which is for 2020, the minimum RPS for the state is 33%, and we're suggesting somewhere around 35%, and then 65% carbon-free resources, non-RPS that is, that you consider selling some of our renewable resources that we have in our portfolio today, which are more valuable than the carbon-free resources that we have. And so in either case, there's a range of savings that we could get, and we can talk a little bit about that. So the way we see it, there's three main policy decisions that you'll be grappling with tonight. The first one being, PG&E's 2020 carbon-free allocation, whether we should accept it or not. And if we do accept it, again, whether we should accept the full allocation, which includes nuclear and large hydro. And then what should our carbon-free portfolio mix for our Green Start program be in 2020? And then last, what resources should we include on our power content label for 2020? So just by way of background, I think we've been up here before, we've talked a little bit about how much more competition there is in the CCA world to deliver a carbon-free portfolio, mix of resources or a higher content of carbon-free resources. And that kind of pressure, that competition has to some extent driven the price of carbon-free resources up quite a bit. We've seen about a 500% increase since the inception of SVCE associated with the premium that one would pay for those carbon-free resources, mainly large hydroelectric resources coming from out of state. And so that correlates to a direct increase in our cost of being able to achieve carbon-free in our portfolio. And then, again, the PCIA, we already pay for these resources that PG&E owns, and right now demonstrates on their power content label for their customers. We pay for those resources, but we get no benefit from that resource. We don't get to count the attributes of the carbon-free, whether it's large hydro, PCC1 resources, or nuclear on our power content label. And then lastly, so the nuclear resource that we're talking about, and we mentioned this when we talked to you guys at the board meeting, the board workshop in October, this is coming from an existing facility that is slated to shut down in 2025. There's no plans to build a new nuclear resource, and certainly if we were to take our allocation, it would not keep this nuclear plant on longer. We're taking it for free, and this is not an incentive or a motivation to keep it going. So while we're only talking about 2020 tonight, there is also the possibility that through the work that CCAs and different load-serving entities is doing with the CPUC, through the PCI Working Group number 3 proceeding, that we could get a longer-term allocation. And we mentioned this again at the IRP workshop back in October, that as part of the IRP, we'll bring to you what those allocations might look like, both from a cost standpoint and a power content label, kind of like what we're doing today, but we're a little bit ahead of ourselves because we have this ability or this opportunity to take this allocation sooner than we thought as an interim solution for 2020. But you can see here that the amount is quite significant. Just as a % of our retail sales, we're looking at a total of about 32% over the next 5-6 years. And that 32% coming from, again, nuclear making up about 18 to 20%, and then large hydroelectricity coming up on it at about 13%. So it's not small. It's certainly worth considering. In the staff report, we talked about, again, 3 scenarios on what we could do in terms of the allocation. And again, not to just sound like a broken record, but we don't have to accept any of this. And if we don't accept any of the allocation, what that means is that PG&E retains that allocation or retains that resource and the attributes associated with that resource and counts that resource on their power content label. And we continue to pay for it at the PCIA, so it's kind of like a status quo. We can accept it, and we have the option to accept only the large hydro, and I guess we could also just accept the nuclear if we wanted to as well, right? But we have that option to just accept the large hydro, and that would be very much consistent with what we demonstrate today on our power content label, which is renewable resources and large hydro. Or again, we can, and this is kind of what we're recommending, is that we accept the full allocation and then decide what to do with it. For 2020, just these numbers here just kind of demonstrate what our position is right now with respect to renewable resources and carbon-free resources. To date, we've acquired essentially enough RPS resources, which we call PCC1, Power Content Category 1, to make up about 47% of our retail sales. So that's almost at our 50% target. We're pretty much there for all intents and purposes. Additionally, we've already acquired a bunch of carbon-free resources for 2020, and that's what we're calling the carbon-free resources procured non-RPS. We've acquired about 41% of our needs there. So we're way on our way to achieving carbon-free without the allocation. So if we take the allocation, which again is another 32% of what we need, then we're obviously going to be surplus. And that's again one of the policies. When we're surplus, what are we going to do? What do we sell? So here we have a couple of four alternatives essentially on what we could do. So the first column, which is the gray column, that's kind of what we're calling the base case, or if we did nothing. If we just left our portfolio the way it is at 50%, and acquired the last remaining amounts that we need to get to 100% carbon-free, and we didn't take any allocation at all, then we estimate our supply costs to achieve carbon-free for Green Start to be about $42 million. And so a lot of this has already been spent, by the way, since we're already at 88%. If we keep our portfolio mix at 50%, and take the full allocation, but sell the large hydro, and therefore count the nuclear on our power content label, then we're looking at a potential supply cost of about $30 million, 30.75, and a savings relative to the do nothing of 42.2. Also, if we, again, left our mix the same, but decided to sell the nuclear and therefore not counted on our power content label, then the savings are a little less at about 6.7. And then last, if we really wanted to save money, and this is a big change in policy, it would require that we reduce our RPS to what we call the minimum compliant, or close to minimum compliant. And in that strategy, we would actually sell off, or try to sell off, what we call our excess renewable resources, which would get a much higher premium than a nuclear resource or even a large hydro resource. And there we stand to save anywhere between $17.3 and $17.8 million. We're slightly surplus, and so we would be selling a little bit, but not very much. So, that's a lot to digest, and we have some time, fortunately. The way things go at the CPUC, they don't go really fast, so we have a little bit of time. The way I understand it, and Ian or Poonam, please correct me if I'm wrong, PG&E has filed what they call an advice letter with the CPUC at the beginning of this month. And that advice letter basically is almost like a permission, like what we're asking from you today, to do this transaction with the CCAs. The earliest that the CPUC can vote on that advice letter is early February 6th. So there's a possibility that they say no, or they could say yes. But at any rate, the soonest that we think that we'll be able to execute something is probably in the March-April timeframe. So we have a little bit of time. And I should say that there's also a risk that all of the carbon-free energy that gets generated between January and March or April, when we actually execute this thing, could just go away or could stay with PG&E. So there's no guarantees that if we don't execute this until March, April, that we'll get any of those attributes retroactively. That's something that the CCAs are working with the California Energy Commission and in the CPUC to try to make sure that we get the full benefit of the whole calendar year, not just the share after it gets approved. So again, the recommendation is that we accept the full allocation, and then depending on where you decide to land on our mix of RPS versus carbon-free for the Green Start only program, that we sell either large hydro, PCC1, or nuclear resources. That's my whole presentation.
Great. Yes, questions, Vice Chair, and then Director Ellenberg.
So I'm a little confused, and maybe I just missed it in the fine print. You talk about not accepting something, and you talk about them giving it to us for free, and I'm suspicious. Why are they trying to give us something for free? And does this impact the PCIA? And what are the real implications of us taking it? And what are the implications of us not taking it? I mean, if it's free, it doesn't change anything else, then it seems like we always should take it. So there's got to be some other subtlety in the why this is going on.
Okay, I'll let Ian jump in too, but when I say for free, we're already paying for this. So the carbon-free portfolio for PG&E's resources or portfolio, they were not included. There was no adder added to them, like RPS has an adder, and therefore there's it's. You can you explain it better, Ian?
Yes. So
thank you.
currently with the PCIA, we pay for brown power, and there is no specification in terms of defining nuclear or large hydro. It's defined as brown power in the PCIA. So we currently pay for that. There is no attribute benchmark for carbon-free. We tried to put that in to the PCIA back in 2018, and we were not successful. But there should be an attribute price for carbon-free, but it currently does not reside in the PCIA. And in terms of the price, if we sign the confirm, there's specific language basically saying that any PCIA paying customer will not go to the commission or the legislature saying that this was not offered. So I think people realize that this is kind of a little bit of it's a bit of iniquity going on in terms of the process. We're paying for this, we're not getting the attribute. PG&E gets to count it on their power content label, and it's not really counted in the PCIA.
So if I may add to this, the CPUC decision at the end of 2018 basically set up some follow-up initiatives, one of them being how PG&E would allocate this power to its customers. Because we brought this issue up before this decision got made at the end of 2018. So we've had these working groups, we call it working group number 3 in the PCIA. This is the issue that's being discussed. They're going to decide the long-term allocation in the middle of the year of 2020. This is the short-term allocation, so it comes out of the decision, and everything else is the same.
So where's the money flow, right? They're just going to give us all these attributes. Our PCIA is not going to change. The way they compute PCIA is not going to change.
Right, so let me explain that. Just say there's 1 kilowatt hour that costs them 10 cents to generate. And the market price is 4 cents for brown power. Today, our PCIA is 6 cents. If that power is coming out of a nuclear resource or a hydro resource, there is a value for carbon-free. We are paying that entire 6 cents. We don't get any of that value. Instead, for that 1 kilowatt hour, we are going out in the market and actually buying a carbon-free resource from BC
Some other
Hydro.
source, right.
So we're paying the full cost. So now, if the PUC had decided there was a value to that carbon-free resource, they would have now said 10 cents is the cost, 4 cents is brown power, say the value of carbon-free is 1 cent. They'd add that value, and our PCIA would have gone down to 5 cents. So we would have netted. So in a way here, by them giving it to us quote unquote free, we're not going out in the market and buying that power. So that's how it nets out.
Okay. And then my second question is more process. I mean, it seems like you need to know whether we want to accept this free gift or not. But the second half about what do we do with it once we have it, it does not appear as though we have to decide that right here and right now. And so I'm wondering if we can come back in the meeting in January or maybe even February when we even know if we're getting it, and then see where some of the rates are landing and PCIAs, and then decide, oh, now it is right to, we should sell the hydro or sell the nuclear or keep it all. Do we really have to decide it all tonight?
So my preference is, if this is a policy decision that's going to come to you, whether it's now or for the long-term IRP, my preference would be for the board to talk about it today. It'll help us in our planning, because we're going to have to make these decisions under uncertainty anyway. Now, my overall sense is, if from a policy standpoint, you can't come to any kind of decision today, going to January makes total sense. But at this point, I would love for us to have that policy discussion, because we're going to have this discussion again in February, March, and April when we talk about the integrated resource plan. And I think this is really going to be helpful for our long-term planning if we have that discussion today.
Director Ellenberg and then Director Corrigan. Oh, I'm sorry that you had your hand. Director Corrigan.
Monica, if you don't mind, would you go back a couple of slides in your presentation, particularly one that had the 3 options, but it was the first of the 2 with the 3 options, if that makes sense.
The recommendation? This one?
Right there. Okay, so the way I read the bottom one, B, option number B, it says if the board selects 35% RPS and 65% carbon-free mix, and then sells RPS, PCC1, and no nuclear on the power content label for an estimated savings. What I'm trying to understand is what I'm trying to make sure we understand as a group or have some opportunity to opine on is, does it matter what we sell? Do we want to bind our hands at this point and make a decision about what gets sold, or do we want to wait and see what the market looks like? Because I think you've already alluded to some of these attributes are worth more than others. And we may decide we want to sell sort of like, as much as we influence the market to our own detriment as well. If we continue to buy all carbon free, and so do all the CCAs, then the market price goes up. And so we may, in fact, decide it's worth selling some of those attributes that are A, more valuable, and B, help. I don't want to sound like I'm trying to influence the market collectively here, but we're creating our own worst enemy by always buying the same thing everybody else is buying. And if we take a contrarian point of view, I'm just wondering if it doesn't help us out both in the immediate short term as well as in the long term.
Yeah, I think one thing is going to be, even though there's a lot of uncertainty about what the value of the different resources that we could sell is going to be, whether we can get $3 for a nuclear type attribute, or $9 for a large hydro attribute, or $18 for a PCC1. I think it's pretty certain that a PCC1 is always going to be much more valuable than large hydro and nuclear, and that large hydro will always be more valuable than the nuclear. And so that's for sure the order. And so what we cannot do, or what we don't feel that we can do without specific policy direction by the board, is to sell the PCC1, because we have a goal to be 50-50. We can certainly decide to sell the large hydro under kind of the mandate that we have now. And what we can't also decide whether to do or not to do without some kind of, I think, explicit decision on your part, is whether or not to include nuclear on our power content label. So those are the big kind of decisions that that we have.
Thank you.
I'm going to go to Director Gibbons first. Director Gibbons, do you have any questions or comments?
Thank you, that's kind. So I think my understanding is that staff planning would benefit from a board decision on 2 things. One is, do we take action and not take any allocation, or do we take an allocation? So that's decision 1. So as it's been explained, it makes sense to me that taking the allocation then brings up the second question, which is, do we keep the renewable and carbon-free split at 50-50, knowing in fact that it's 100% carbon-free, but it's really the 50% renewable that's being discussed. And then there's 2 ways to dispose of the excess that if we accept, correct me if I'm wrong here, So if we accept the allocation, we then have an overage of RA. And since we would then have the overage of RA, we have two choices. If we leave the renewable at 50%, we could sell excess hydro or nuclear, or we could change our policy and go to what the state guideline is of 35% renewable, which then makes the same decision of selling large hydro or nuclear with a larger financial benefit to our customers. Am I reading that chart correctly?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Great, Director Sayoc, then Director Smith.
Actually, Director Gibbons had followed the train of logic I was going to ask Monica to confirm. And so what I'd love to ask my fellow directors, for me, coming into this meeting, number one, after the workshop, I felt very comfortable tonight saying that the PG&E carbon-free allocation, accepting that. I think that's the consensus, at least I heard from the workshop. What I'd love to hear more is there even a consideration to change our portfolio mix? Because to me, that's the larger policy decision that would help narrow what we would sell, given an overage. And in my mind, I have not heard any discussion of why we would want to change our portfolio mix other than the cost savings. So again, that's where my mind is right now, and I prefer to stay at 50-50, but I'd love to hear if there's any argument to persuade me in the other direction.
Director Smith, did you have comments?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, why don't you go ahead? And then, yes, we'll do questions, and then I'd like to open it up to the public, and then we'll bring it back to have the actual discussion.
Yeah, so I have a question about the terms energy and attribute. What exactly is the distinction? What are attributes as you were discussing them?
That's a good question. So usually when we talk about energy, we talk about a bundled product where we get both the energy, the electricity delivered to the Cal ISO on our behalf, plus the environmental attribute associated with that energy that's produced, that megawatt hour or kilowatt hour that's produced. When we talk about just attributes, we don't actually get the energy scheduled on our behalf. Instead, we settle it out, and we only pay for the environmental attribute, whether it's a PCC1 or large hydro or nuclear. So we're only paying for the ability to count the carbon freeness of it, but we don't get the energy associated with it.
Okay. This is very dense.
Yes.
So another, I think a concern that I have is that if we go with the recommendation for 35% RPS and the 35-65 mix, then we aren't distinguishing ourselves particularly. So theoretically, the board could pick another mix of I guess, what do you call it? I guess
Our RPS percentage.
yeah, we could pick a different different target RPS percentage, like 40% or something like that, to continue to be able to say that we're different than PG&E in doing the minimum. Is that correct?
Yes, very much so. And we are different than PG&E in that this mix of resources is 100% carbon free, which PG&E is not.
That's our tagline.
Okay. So I think a bit, I personally don't have issues with keeping and selling the nuclear, but I think it is maybe a concern for some of our, residents. So, and you say that this would, if we if we proceeded with, oh gosh, okay. So can I ask, because this is kind of difficult to track between what the original one is. So the 7th slide where there's the 3 scenarios, scenario number 2 is the original staff recommendation, is that correct?
So the original staff recommendation said to accept the full allocation, a large hydro and nuclear, but it said to sell off only the nuclear. And so that definitely generates some savings, but it doesn't generate the maximum amount of savings.
And that one is not actually described in the new set of slides, is that correct?
It would be essentially in the yellow here where it says 50% RPS, 50% carbon-free, sell nuclear. So that's essentially that alternative.
Okay, so that particular column is option 2.
Right. So that would generate
And then-
savings, just not the maximum amount of savings.
And then the yellow column, the first one is basically where we sell large hydro is basically 3A, basically, is that right?
So
yeah, if you look on the last, I guess,
this one here.
3A, yeah, so that would be like, so essentially A and B here are basically option 3?
So
Scenario
just
3?
the staff report,
I guess it's like,
the 3 scenarios that were laid out in the staff report were only about how much of an allocation or what to accept in the allocation. And then we added to essentially what was scenario number 3, a recommendation to then, okay, you're going to accept the full allocation and then sell only the nuclear. We didn't provide a whole lot of alternatives about what if we just sold the large hydro or what if we sold the PCC1. So again, we were prompted to look at the full range
I
of
see,
strategies,
okay.
and
I
that's
see,
what that happened
okay.
afterwards. Yeah.
So there's, okay, I see. All right, I understand now. Okay, I will continue to review my notes and yield the floor to the next person.
Okay, great, thank you. Director Sings? We'll go on this side.
My comments are more comments than questions, so I'd be happy to
Great.
wait till we've heard from the public.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
So I do have a quick question. Thanks, Chair. And it goes along the lines of what Nancy was asking, what Director Smith was asking, because I also wanted clarification on which of the different, is it the yellow or the salmon columns that you're recommending as scenario number 3. So if I understand you correctly, scenario number 3 could either be the current, under the 50-50, the current RPS cell nuclear, which only gets a 6.7, or the 35-65 minimum RPS cell nuclear, which would get a 17.3.
Right. So yeah, there's in the staff report, we only provided alternatives about how much allocation to accept.
Right.
And then we then further went on to say, and if we're surplus, sell the nuclear. So this is now saying stick with scenario 3, accept the full allocation, and then depending on what you want your power content label to look like for 2020, that will determine what we sell.
And apart from the savings, are there other things we should consider as to why one may be better than the other? Let's say as a board, we have narrowed it down to, because I'm looking at it either, the current RPS cell nuclear under the 50-50 scenario versus the column that has the 35-65, we sell the nuclear and we end up with 17.3. And so the obvious difference there for me is the savings. But I'm just curious whether or not there are other factors we should consider apart from the savings when we're looking, for me, as I look at this, to make that distinction.
It's our value proposition and what we're offering, and we are 100% carbon free, but embedded within being 100% carbon free, I think we take certain pride in having an RPS that exceeds the state mandate. And so that is something that is part of our value proposition. So it's definitely a change in policy.
And so that would go back to what Marika was saying, where we stick to our original policy of 50-50, and that's another distinguishing factor for the organization. Thank you.
Right.
Any other questions on this side? Oh, yes, Director Alahi.
So this almost seems like a no-brainer sometimes. It's like somebody is selling you nuclear and then letting you turn around and sell it to somebody else and make $6.7 million. Am I reading that correctly?
We're paying for it already.
So that's almost like a non-brainer. I mean, you go ahead and buy it and then you just turn around and sell it. I mean, it's a question for us whether we want to touch nuclear or not, in a sense, and even though you're not physically going to touch nuclear. But why is that happening? Why is PG&E willing to just drop $6.7 million in our pockets?
So
I mean,
PG&E will not be giving us any money. We would just avoid either purchasing or we end up surplus, and then we try to monetize that surplus position. And I just want to reiterate that all of these numbers are estimated, and they all assume that we're able to sell it, and we're able to sell it at the prices that we put in here. If every CCA in California decides that they don't want to accept nuclear on their power content label, then that surplus nuclear becomes zero. And then our choices are, if we want to monetize something, large hydro, we know will have some value to it, and PCC1 will have value as well.
So the value that we're getting is because we have excess, or we will have excess hydro.
Exactly.
Or something else. And
Exactly.
that's when the question comes in. If you sell more of the hydro, actually it's the RPS resources. If you sell more of those, you make more money, is what it looks like.
Exactly.
But there's no guarantee on any of that. So I guess at this point,
So
there's no risk to saying, okay, fine, we'll accept the full allocation, and then when the time comes, we decide what we want to get rid of.
Well, if I can, I think this goes back to what I was asking. I don't want to. I want to be careful about binding ourselves to a certain outcome when we can't really guarantee what the market's going to look like, who the buyers are going to be, how many there'll be, what they'll be willing to pay. So I just want to be.
I think
Sorry.
Sergio has a
yeah,
response
I'll
to
just
that.
emphasize that point that you're making and Monica's making. These numbers are based on estimates of market prices. We all know the one thing we can be 100% sure of is these market prices
I'm gonna fluctuate.
will be different when we actually go to sell.
Right.
But the relative differences between them will hold. PCC1 has the highest value. Next in terms of value is large hydro, and last in terms of value is nuclear. So one of the things that the board and us, we have to grapple with is making those decisions under uncertainty, whether it's uncertainty in terms of timing, uncertainty in terms of quantity, uncertainty in terms of price. But what we framed for you in terms of your policy decision, if you choose one of the yellow columns or one of the salmon columns, you'll be correct in terms of relative value.
So I'm going to actually go ahead and take public comment, and then we'll bring it back for more questions and deliberations, since I think it's going to be a little bit more time on that. So I have Bruce Carney. Welcome.
Thank you for the opportunity to address you again. I'm Bruce Carney, speaking on behalf of myself only, but I am the chair of Carbon Free Mountain View and have been for a number of years. So 6 years ago, it was Carbon Free Mountain View that worked with Cupertino, Mountain View, Sunnyvale, and the county to get the ball rolling to create this agency. And so the carbon-freeness of your portfolio mix, I think, stemmed from the carbon-free in our name. And there was no particular push on our part back then to say it should be 50% RPS, 50% large hydro. That was just the way the finances worked out 3 or 4 years ago when the first contracts were executed. And now we've heard that existing large hydro is 5 times more expensive than it was 3 or 4 years ago. That's the kind of thing that would make anyone go back and question their allocation strategy. The thing that you didn't see on the slide, of course, is how will the customers react if they were to find out that there is nuclear in their portfolio? How would the customers react if they find out that There's only 35% California eligible renewables instead of 50%. Well, my sense is that there will be some customers who would be quite upset at either outcome, but very few of those kinds of customers, because as anyone knows who's looked at a PG&E bill, you can't figure out what's going on. Anybody who's looked at a power content label, well, who looks at a power content label besides, the 13 of you and me?
Howard.
Just the geeks in this
Howard.
So let me talk about what I hope will happen. So I hope that 10 years from now, this agency still exists. I hope it's financially sound. I hope that during the preceding 10 years, you've had funding to put into programs to bend the carbon curve. To me, the first part of the agency's mission has been checked off and accomplished. It was actually the easier part of buying existing renewables and carbon-free resources. The next parts are to build and operate, or to build and contract for new carbon-free resources. That additionality is really what the most well-informed environmentalists want to see from an agency like SVCE. So when you announce new contracts and energy storage plus solar, those are the kinds of things that make us happy. And it's because, California needs more energy storage. We need more renewables. And I should also say that California is the only jurisdiction I know of that doesn't think that large hydro is renewable. If you go to any European country, they'll talk about large hydro, small hydro in the same breath as wind and solar. So this is a bit of a delusion that we've created for ourselves in California. Nuclear is obviously not renewable, but it is a carbon-free resource. And as has been said, you're not building anymore, you're not keeping what exists today online longer. So yes, there will probably be some public pushback, but I don't think there will be a lot of it. And so the question I think should be uppermost in your mind is, which decision does the most to ensure that SVCE will be around in 10 years and that it can fund its decarbonization programs?
Thank you. Any other members of the public wishing to speak? Yes, please. Come forward. If you could just state your name.
Hi, Brian Mekachuk. I'm from Monte Sereno. I think that if we put nuclear on the label, that would be a bad thing. And when I've gone through a couple of meetings in both Los Gatos and Monte Sereno on changing the REACH codes, there were a lot of people that questioned, is this just a shell game? What's going on? And I think it's important to not have nuclear on the label. Thanks.
Thank you. Other members of the public wishing to speak? If not, we'll bring it back to the board. Yes, Director Sinks and Director Elahi and Vice Chair.
Well, having been here from the beginning, I think we have to go back to basics. What was our objective in forming this agency? I think for many of us, we saw the risk of climate. And so, frankly, RPS is a political statement. Saying I'm against nuclear when you have a nuclear resource is, it may be an argument about safety and other things, but it's not an argument about climate. So I think thinking first about considering, number one, that our objective ought to continue to be carbon-free, and our viability to fund decarbonization programs. If that's our mission, I think you look to the scenario that gives you an extra, 17.8 versus 11.4, or 17.3 versus 6.7. I think you look to a strategy that tries to maximize. I frankly don't think RPS is anything, the thing we want to lose our opportunity and our agency for. I think it is, we want to stand on being carbon-free. That's the first thing. The second is, if we take a look at what's going on in the state, we've just heard about how our PCA is going up erratically. Year after year after year, it's gone up. How much Are we gonna, are we looking over a 12-year period?
Well, you mean a 12-month period?
Yes.
Yeah, around 18 months, it'll be about up to between 40 and $50 million.
Okay, so at this point, right, we're looking at an existential threat to the to the community choice energy movement. And I think we have to go back to what really is foundational, and I think that is carbon-free. Now, we take a look at how we are viewed in the state. I think many of us would like to think that, well, okay, if we can't get have the grid become a public entity, we think it makes sense for other CCAs to be able to form on reasonable terms, to be able to control electricity supply. I think one of the things we have to recognize here is PG&E is losing customers. They got to do something with all this electricity they're generating. So, you know, because of how they've pitched things, we're continuing to take it in the shorts on this PCIA. I think it only makes good sense to take these resources. And I would further say that it makes a lot of sense to let staff figure out what's optimal. I mean, we can say we don't want to decide, and so what that basically does is tie staff's hands. If they think that an optimal time to buy or sell a resource is now as opposed to later, by not giving them the opportunity to go forward, we're diminishing their flexibility. So I would urge us to act tonight. I think we are, if you take a look at the slide that shows how much carbon-free resource we have yet to buy, our open position, if you turn to that slide 6, you can show that one.
I think it's number 8.
6.
Oh, 6.
Yeah. If you take a look at this one, you can see that we are, we have almost all of our position open starting in 2022, meaning we've got to get going to fill that position. So we are going to have to look at spending real money for carbon-free resources, and what we've heard about large hydro makes sense. You know, the good news is we've made a big difference in the world, right? We now see other states that are saying, hey, wait a minute, I'm Washington, I want to go the same direction. So that power is considerably more dear than it was. We've got to, I think, get back to basics here. And finally, I would observe that the benefit of nuclear more than these other sources is it allows us to cover our base load. There are going to be times when the sun doesn't shine, and the wind doesn't blow, and the water doesn't flow, right? With climate, we're going to be experiencing more and more drought. We also know that today, we get to put things on our label based on the assets, the power we acquire, the attributes we acquire for an entire year, right? It's integrated through the whole year. But that's going to change soon, right? We're going to be measured on what we can produce from each of these sources by the day and then by the hour. And so I would argue, if we're responsible players in the state, our real choice is going to come down to, yeah, do we have to take some natural gas? That's what we're going to be faced with to provide dispatchable power. And frankly, for me, a choice between nuclear and natural gas, one carbon-free, the other not. We are not going to build another Diablo Canyon. I'm not talking about that. It's simply taking that power and making the smart financial decision. And I again would say, right, for the difference here, we could be funding decarbonization programs much more robustly, or protecting our reserves, just depending on how all these things come out. So I would move that I don't want to move yet. I think we need more discussion, but I would hope that we could figure out how to act tonight, or at the very least queue up an effective decision at our January meeting. Thanks.
So in the interest of time and trying to maybe move this along a bit, I get a sense that there's consensus on recommendation 1, to accept the full allocation. Am I correct? Could I do a straw vote on, and actually, I guess I have to ask Director Gibbons too, folks
Yes.
support accepting the full allocation? Anyone opposed
Yes.
to that? Thank you, Director. Anyone opposed to that or abstaining? So, yes.
A question on allocation, accepting the full allocation. Is that costing us something extra to buy that nuclear allocation? Or
No.
is it just part of it? Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. So, let's just then move to the second part. And,
If I could.
yes.
There are two sort of issues here. You know, one is what do we do with it after we get it? And I got to say, Courtney, I think, is really right on, which is we should, and Rod is right on, we should authorize staff, give staff the flexibility to do what's economically right within some parameters that we want. I don't want to say absolutely sell it right away or whatever, because it could be totally wrong. I don't want to sell something when it's worthless. The other half of the decision, which is part on number 3, and the way I'm going to say it, I don't mean to offend anybody, but has it gotten so bad that we have decided we need to sell the family China? Because that's what number 3 is, right? We have PCC1 RECs that we have. They're valuable, you know, $18, right? We could make real money by selling those. But those are an asset that we have based on the values that we had to try to get, you know, 50% RPS. And I'll go through the history of that in just a second. But there are two totally separate things here. One is this allocation and what do we do with it? And then the other one is life gotten so bad that we have to say we're not going to be 50% anymore and we're going to go to some lower value so we can monetize the stuff that Monica's already bought for us. And on that issue, I was the first person to say RPS was total political definition. And why are we the only state? We have Southern California and Northern California, and San Diego Light and Power didn't like that PG&E had all the hydro, right? So there's political reasons why hydro is not considered renewable. Political reasons don't fix the environment. And if we are about trying to make a better environment for the future, you know, we have to think about what we're doing. Now, on the allocation side, I am fine. Carbon-free car, this is good. Figure out what we can do with it to make a little money. On the RPS side, the reason we wanted to be above the minimum of the state is because we felt that that would drive investment industry-wide. This is where new power plants will be built to provide more RPS. So if you recall, for those of us who were here, staff said they didn't care about carbon-free. They said, let's be 70% RPS and 30% brown. And we rejected that on the very first formal board meeting, which was, no, we should be 100% carbon-free. And we arm wrestled a little bit over RPS, and we picked as a compromise position, and really was a compromise, the 50%. At that time, it was double what the state wanted. We felt that being above the state minimum was going to help drive the industry to build additional renewable resources in the state of California. And then just for reference, I just looked up PG&E. Everybody knows PG&E is already 70% carbon-free because they have all the hydro, all the nuclear, and then their renewables. And every time they lose load, they seem to become more carbon-free. So we need to stay 100% carbon-free. The question about whether now is the time to start selling our PCC1 RECs that we've already bought to make some money, and this isn't infinite money, it doesn't go forever, it's only till we run out of the RECs that Monica's bought. I am not sure that this is the exact moment that we should be selling our PCC1. So what I'm advocating for is we keep the line at 50%. We're going to have to see how the world unfolds with this famous trap door that we're running into and all the other stuff. And if it is really a bad economic situation, we may have to sell the family China. But I think that we should hold the line because that's what's going to drive building new stuff in the state of California. On the accepting side, I think we're 100% right. Let's accept it. And I'd really like to back what Courtney said, which is let's empower staff to take what we get and figure out the mix. On the issue of nuclear, which is sort of the last elephant in the room, I'm just very practical. It's carbon-free, and it's going to be almost worthless. And so do we sell it worthless so it doesn't go on our label, or do we keep it because it's carbon-free? We're not impacting the safety. Then that fuel is loaded in the plant already. The plant is not being changed. It's on whatever earthquake fault it already is. The power is already going to be produced. You know, we can get a couple million for it, or maybe less, depending on the way the market's going to be when we get it. It might not be worth as much effort to get rid of it as it sounds, but I could be swayed either way.
We have Director Corrigan and Director Ellenberg.
So I'll keep my comments very brief, but I think you all know where I stand on this already, just from my earlier questions. I guess I actually separate it two different ways: what's principle and what's practical. I think to Bruce Carney's comments, you know, it's noble to have the principles that SVC has, but at some point we also have to outweigh how valuable that principle is versus the practicality and the value of the longevity and sustainability of SVCE in the marketplace, and what obligation we have to our customers to keep costs down. So I look at this as I would actually go even further than Howard and say I'm comfortable even changing the mix if necessary. I would really defer to our executive team and staff to bring it back if it was a substantial substantive change to the content. But if you're going to drop to 42% from 50, that is not going to freak me out. And I really practically agree with Bruce. I think there's still an awful lot of customers getting their bill that don't even know who SVCE is, much less what our power label and RPS and content all really is. And as painful as this may be, very few of them who will care. What they care about is the bottom line cost, as do I. So I would take the brakes off to the extent that this is a decision the staff's going to need to make, and one of our best assets is being nimble and being quick to respond, quick to understand what's going on with the marketplace and where we fit into it and what we have that's of value and how we leverage that. So I'm comfortable taking it, number one, and I'm also comfortable selling whatever we deem most appropriate to sell when that time comes as a result of having more than we need.
Director Ellenberg.
This has been a really impressive and powerful conversation, and I just want to appreciate all of you for the points that you've made. It's been helping me think through the pieces of this that I think are baseline important. And while the technical pieces are still a challenge, what I see and what attracted me to serve on this board was the commitment to 100% carbon-free. Mm-hmm. I think that's vitally important, regardless of whether every customer fully appreciates that number. And you know, with great respect, I understand that a bottom line is important, but we make philosophical decisions about that all the time. We try not to buy from sweatshops. We have other considerations besides the bottom line, economic, and sometimes we'll even choose something that is less economically feasible because of a series of other values. And I think that if we start down a slope where we are behaving like other energy companies and not holding to principle, then at some point we're another alternative that may or may not be equivalent to PG&E should they survive. And why do we need to exist? I think that there's more here that is worth saving and preserving. So I would like to stay with the 50%. Regarding the sale, I'm wondering structurally if we can, rather than make a decision today, perhaps set a floor. If the value goes below a certain amount, can we issue tonight a delegation that would be triggered at a time that the executive and staff thinks that that makes the most sense, rather than trying to guess ourselves or wait until January or make a decision prematurely.
Director Gibbons, do you have any comments? And then I have
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the conversation as well. Could Monica clarify when it would be anticipated that we would want to sell?
So the earliest we would ever sell is once we were 100% sure that we got an allocation and what the allocation was going to be. So that could potentially be as early as March, April. So we wouldn't sell anything until then, because otherwise we'd be speculating, and we don't do that. So maybe May, June timeframe. The sooner.
So that's good. So that's good news to this discussion. That's giving me a comfort level. And then just to the point about so one of the things I commented about this slide, it says 50% carbon free or 65% carbon free. It's a little bit of a misnomer because both of them are 100% carbon free. One of the carbon free on one, 50% of that carbon free is renewable, and on the other one, the 35% is renewable. So it's a little bit confusing there, but they're both 100%. And the 35% number is relative to the state goal for 2021, am I correct? That all power be minimum of 35% renewable?
So we're talking about 2020, and the minimum RPS right now is 33%. So the 35% target was so that we could also account for changes in load and uncertainty that we have associated with that. So plus being slightly above the minimum. We don't ever want to go exactly, because then things happen, suppliers default, load changes.
Right, but 35% 2021 goal.
Right. No, 2020 goal. Yeah, 35% is the state RPS for 2021, but we're talking about 2020 here. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was exactly my point, Monica. That we're discussing. One of the things that's important here is we're discussing 2020 only. This isn't a long-term pattern. This is addressing 2020, and we're already ahead of the state goal if we go to the 35% RPS.
Correct.
Okay, so those are just two of my points. So from my perspective, I would love to stay at the 50% renewable. I am flexible by the time April, May, June comes around to revisit the 35%. If that seems appropriate, depending on what happens with the PCIA, because if the PCIA looks like it's going to go haywire, we do need to be prepared to have a second look at our cash flow. So I would look at that with that in mind. I don't mind having the nuclear on the portfolio in the sense that it's already being produced. We're not causing the power to be produced nuclear. We are, as someone mentioned earlier, being cost effective for our customers. And I do think that that's quite relevant, because that is what they pay attention to. So I'm okay. I like the idea of buying it and selling it, but I'm open-minded to keeping it if it's a great cost-effective decision to make. If that helps anyone, so I would be supportive of not, if staff needs a decision tonight, I would be okay with whatever the majority wants, either 50-50 or 35-65, whatever the majority wants. And I would say what we sell is determined in the April, May, June timeframe when more is known.
Thank you, Director Gibbons. If I can jump in before we do another round, I appreciate the discussion. Coming in, I was pretty open to option B, but and I wasn't here in the first year, so part of it was that I didn't really know what the reasoning was for the 50% RPS requirement. Listening to Mr. Carney, and we're from the same community, and having just gone through the REACH code conversation, debate that's still continuing, the biggest revelation for me was that, like Bruce said, very few people even know what SVCE is, and it's no one's fault. It's just that. Oh, maybe okay.
Bruce, I don't want to put that words into Bruce's mouth.
Yeah, we had one gentleman the other week who is pretty up on green issues, but even he thought the power was still coming from PG&E. So I guess what I try to look at this from the layperson's, our customers' eyes. And so that's the revelation is honestly, this is probably way, way more than, our customers would be able to grasp. We just have to even just educate them that we're here and we're the ones providing the energy. But I do think that the carbon-free mission is really the priority at this time. And so, and then the next thing is, I do agree that as part of the education is for us to be able to provide our value to the community through the different programs that we offer. So in light of that, and I guess I'm still trying to understand, when we need to do this, is this in light of the PCIA discussion? If we go through the process and let's say PCI, we don't get hit with the huge hit, then can we put this off? And so my thought was similar, can we just set parameters and then have staff make those decisions when the time comes if we need to go here? Because to me, going B, I guess, is sort of the last resort. And I was thinking, can we go have that range from 50 to 35 based on just the, how dire the straits become or don't become, and leave it up to staff to decide, what that percentage should be at a certain point in time. I will also say, though, I agree with the gentleman from Monte Sereno, going back to the, customers, a layperson's perspective, and it's also maybe me too emotionally because of my background. Nuclear is kind of a no-no, and so I would like to just offload that or avoid putting that on our content label as much as possible. So I guess I'm trying to kind of come up with a tier of what my priorities would be. So carbon-free first, no nuclear, and then just a range based on, where we are in terms of financial.
Yeah, you said the word dire, and the way that I understand the numbers, Don's going to shake his head one way or the other, but originally we thought we were going to net an extra 45 million or so to go into reserves. Then they're going to hit us with all this PCIA stuff. It's only a net of 30 million that's going to go into our reserves. That's before they invoke the trapdoor clause. Is that dire? Is 30 million going in a dire enough situation to change our long-term goal of 50%? If the trapdoor falls out and it goes down to 20 million going into our reserves, again, we're still net positive for the year. Is that the dire point where we start selling the PCC1 RECs? I won't call them the family China because they're just an asset. Is that the point where we start
they're power,
selling?
not RECs, right?
Well,
they're PC1 attributes.
So I guess that is my question. I don't know where maybe we are the ones who have to decide what dire means, but
just so everybody's clear, right? We're not talking about not making money this year under any of the scenarios that have been put forth so far.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, we thought we were going to do 45. Now it looks like 30, and there's cause to believe it could be worse than that. But again, we don't know. As PG&E plays their game, we won't know till early next year. When do we say, put the farm on the auction block? I shouldn't say it that way again. It's just an attribute. We can sell them, we can buy them.
But I think it's important to remember that having the reserves is more than just being able to run programs. It's being able to provide a
cushion.
discount to the current prevailing rates that PG&E's putting out and
So let's
stay
do it,
below
let's
the
do it,
PCIA.
let's do it in terms of reserves. Is there a big difference between 110 million and 125 million for reserves, right? Is that dire enough situation to say that we don't want to continue to push the renewables so that we can continue to encourage new renewable development in the state?
I think I
that's-
would feel
that-
much more different
that-
about this if this was a.
But that's a totally different discussion than this allocation that we have to make. We've put two things together that don't need to be put together. The allocation and what do we do with it is one decision.
Right.
And the other one is, how do we adjust our execution model to continue the viability of the organization, giving the onslaught that we're getting from the PCIA shenanigans that are going on. They're just two separate decisions. And we should consider the one about the economics, not in the light of whether we're selling nuclear or whatever. It should be considered in the light of what does it mean to be 50% or 35%, and what does it mean to our finances? That's all I'm saying.
All right, Director Elahi's been patient, so.
Yeah, I think we've kind of given the guidelines to staff to come up with a suggestion as, what to sell when the time comes to sell. There's also hedging, which means if you're selling nuclear now, you also need to buy resources 3 years down the road. And, that
I don't
hedging.
think so, no.
No, this is all
This is
2020.
all going to go away
Well,
in
no,
2025 anyway. This is for the next 5 years. These
So, no,
projects.
so this allocation you're telling me is only for next year, or is it also all the way through 2025?
It's only, tonight's discussion is only related to 2020, but when we bring back the IRP discussion in February and March, we will have a discussion of whether to accept the nuclear allocation and large hydro allocation through 2025.
Okay, so that discussion will take
Yeah.
place. And since Diablo is going to shut down in 2025, the nuclear resource will not be available for CCAs, which probably will lead to a higher pricing on hydro and other carbon-free generation. So we do need to build up our reserves through 2025, so that when that time comes, we have that extra funding available to do that. So I think that's an important thing. And the reason I mention hedging is because, and that's what the staff has to do, is to look at it and say, if you're selling something now, we also need to buy something back 2 years later or 3 years later, so that, as to the price, whether it goes down or up.
Right.
If you do a hedge, you don't have to worry about whether it's going up or down, because if it goes down for up to 2025, then the price for 2026 will also go down. So it's just the difference between those two prices.
Right. In the outer years beyond 2020, as Director Miller pointed out, we have quite a deficit, quite a net open position. And so we would actually not be in a position to sell anything. Even if we accepted the full allocation, we would most likely not be able to sell it because it'll just be to meet our portfolio.
understand.
And I wanted to make one comment to a point that Director or Chairperson Abby Koga made. One risk that we have if we take the full allocation, including the nuclear, and we're not able, and we don't want it on our power content label, but we're not able to sell it, then there is a risk, depending on how the regulations associated with the power content label play out, that we'll still have to put some fraction of it on our power content label if we're not able to sell it.
So then,
there's
can
no-
we not take the nuclear?
Well, I'm not saying that I'm just wanting to be clear that if we take it, there's no guarantees that we can sell it
Right.
all.
Well, that's why
And if
I-
we're not able to sell it all, what happens to it? Does it show up on our
Right.
power content
And,
label?
and that's my question is, I guess I'm starting to, it seems like nuclear is so, we have no idea. And it seems like the value of it is lessening. So is it really worth taking is the question I would pose.
You've already
So-
carried the whole group and had consensus and a straw vote that we were all in agreement we were going
Right.
to take it. So before we.
Sure.
Do you want to re-question the whole
Yeah,
group here?
and we haven't, I mean, I didn't realize that, so we can start over. And we haven't
But
taken
can
a
we-
motion.
So
But
Chair-
I guess I wanted to ask the Monica and CEO, do we need to decide on Part B tonight? Because I just feel like I don't think I'm really up on everything enough to make that decision of the exact percentage, and I'm not sure if others feel the same.
So,
Like, can we
yeah.
bring this back and
Yes, I
maybe
could.
have an even more in-depth, maybe
Right.
it's a workshop item that then we have a little more discussion on, but I don't feel like there's the urgency tonight, and maybe we're not quite ready to make this decision.
Let me clarify.
I
I
don't
do
know if we have
think,
consensus.
let me clarify. I do think there is an urgency and importance for all of you to discuss it today. And I think what you're doing today is really very, very useful to us. My suggestion is, we may not have heard from everyone completely yet. I would suggest that you take this as far as you could go. I don't think we are ready to make a decision,
Yes.
but I really think it's very valuable to continue the discussion of these. What I'm hearing right now is that, yeah, let's accept it. Let's kind of stay at 50-50. Let's wait to see how these PCIA risks unfold. And then maybe we'll come back and say, all right, now it's no longer 50-50. We think it makes sense to go 35-65. We're still 100% carbon free in every alternative that we are talking about. It's just how much green and other carbon free that we are looking at over here. And then a last point, Chair Abikoga, when you talk about the value of nuclear, to the extent that the value of nuclear is low, if we keep it in our portfolio, then we sell the high value stuff. So by keeping the low value nuclear in our portfolio, we get to say we're carbon free and we sell the high value. So actually keeping nuclear in our portfolio gets us more net revenues. Now,
Right.
there's the political aspect
that's-
also,
yes,
which
there's
is
a balancing.
obviously being talked about, and it's a issue for all of you. So I think from a timing perspective, I'll repeat my first point, it's super useful because this will help us with how we look at the IRP and the longer term IRP, which has a lot more cost impacts for all of us.
Can I add one more thing too? So I think that for sure we want direction on whether to accept the full allocation or not. That is really important for us to have sooner rather than later. And then what we decide to sell after that, assuming we get the full allocation, while that can wait, the truth of the matter is that we already are going to start having discussion with other CCAs about who can absorb what and how we would sell it. So those discussions have to happen simultaneously as we go through this process of getting this allocation. Because as soon as we get the allocation, what we anticipate doing is turning around and finding a buyer for it right away so we can get the most value of it. Because every month that passes is a month that we don't get to count that, and if we don't sell it, they don't get to count it either. So there is a little bit of urgency here. We don't have that much time. The big holdup is going to be the CPUC decision, but as soon as that's made, we want to be ready to execute. So.
All right, we're going to continue, Director Fligor and then Director Elahi.
Thank you, Chair. Just a clarification, Monica, because I think when the Chair took the straw poll earlier, I think everybody raised their hands saying they do support accepting the entire carbon-free allocation. But you made a point a few minutes ago that if we're not able to sell, because I do hear reservation, including myself, about putting nuclear on the PCL on the label. And so your point earlier about if we're not able to sell the nuclear, there may be some requirement of us to put it on the label. Could you talk more about that? Because that may influence.
Yeah.
Yes, in terms of the new power content label, you're able to count all of your RPS as the percentage of your retail sales. Any sort of over procurement above your retail sales, it is reduced ratably across your large hydro, your nuclear, and your unspecified purchases. So even if we had some nuclear on the power content label, it would be reduced if we had over procurement, by a certain percentage. I know it's a little confusing because the regs are a little confusing on AB 1110. I believe we have an example of the power content label in the staff report, and we can probably provide you another one showing different examples of what it would look like.
Right. So another way of saying it is, say we end up we over procure because we took the allocation and we had already procured resources before the allocation, and say we end up with 10,000 megawatt hours more than what we need for our load. Well, the power content label only allows you to add up to 100%, right? So one would assume, oh, if it's 10% over and it's 10,000 megawatt hours over, just don't list the nuclear on your power content label, pretend that it doesn't exist. But the new regulations would say that we'd have to take a share of that 10,000 and actually demonstrate it on our power content label, even though it's surplus to what we need. And so it's not going to be the full 10,000 megawatt hours, but it'll be some fraction of that we'll have to demonstrate. And we'll demonstrate less of a hydroelectric resource. So.
And just a quick follow-up, Chair. And do we know what the market is then for nuclear? And is there time by which,
Yeah, we don't know what the market is for nuclear right now. I mean, it's not a very kind of a fungible product. There's not a whole lot of it on the market. It's going to be very dependent on what other boards like yourself do throughout the state with CCAs, and whether or not they're all going to have the same discussion about whether they want to see this on their power content label or not. If there's one out there who's willing to have it on their power content label, then
anyone who's going to take it. All right. We have this side, Director Lahey, Director Smith, Director Montano.
So I just wanted to follow up. You used a number of 20% for nuclear. So not that I support nuclear or I've decided one way or the other on that, but is that an arbitrary number? I mean, could we purchase 50% nuclear or 100% nuclear?
No, that number represents our pro rata share of PG&E's nuclear facility, based on our load, share of PG&E's load. So that's an actual number.
Director Smith?
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to respond to some of the comments from earlier, the stated positions. I haven't really come down on this. What I want to optimize for is our values and our uniqueness relative to PG&E. And to me, PG&E provides nuclear, and they are at 35% RPS. So one of the ways we distinguish ourselves is that we've said 50% RPS and no nuclear. And yet the other thing I want to optimize for is the ongoing stability and ability of SVCE to provide fuel switching programs and going carbon free. So I would, in that manner, I'm more aligned with Directors Ellenberg and Miller, but in terms of flexibility, I'm more aligned with Director Gibbons and Director Corrigan. So when Girish, you were, when you were summarizing what you heard, I would just say that's accurate from what I'm hearing as well, except that there is a fairly vocal contingent here that's saying, 50% RPS is great and renewable is important. It's a part of our values. But, reality may set in here that the economics of the situation are such that we need to reconsider. The jump from 50% to 35%, as you stated, is maybe a bit of a shelf that may not, there are numbers between 50 and 35. So those are the things I'm optimizing for: our distinctness, our values, and our viability. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Director Montano?
Thank you, Chair. So I think our mantra really is carbon-free.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree with Rod that we do need to keep nuclear in our portfolio. It will help. It would help us with the credits, right? As you mentioned.
Yeah. So if we keep nuclear, keeping nuclear saves the most money.
Yeah, and And, you know, I look at all these other countries that have nuclear energy, so I think there's this fear factor in our society, but I think it's time to move forward, you know, and not think of it as, you know, something that's radioactive. I think we've come a long way. So I agree that we should have nuclear 50%. Those are my thoughts.
Can I just ask you to clarify your last statement? You're in favor of taking it, but you're concerned that you do limit it to 50% of our total load, or do you care if the staff has the flexibility?
I'm going with A, but I would like staff to be able to have that flexibility. So.
Thank you.
All right, I just, yeah, I think I would like to start trying to wrap this up, so do you have any
Yeah, I was
thoughts
just
on
going
where we
to
should go?
verbalize maybe a summary. We
Okay.
will bring this back in January.
Okay.
We're going to revisit this. I don't think we are ready to make a decision.
No, I don't
But I
either.
need to say that this discussion has been extremely helpful. So I think and I can realize we've got to provide you maybe some additional analysis too. For example, what if we're not going to take any nuclear? Because we want to eliminate the risk of a pro rata push or
Mandate.
put on
Yeah.
our PCL. We'll show you then, we'll show you 50-50,
Mhm.
what the value is if we take just large hydro. If the PCIA goes sideways, we'll come up with some additional alternatives between 50 and 35, so it's not a shelf.
Mhm.
Maybe we'll come up with a couple of
sliding
in-between so we
scale.
can draw a line in between and you start to weigh those options together. I think we have enough direction from you to reframe and provide some additional analysis. Some of your questions regarding timing, et cetera, also your questions about delegating to staff when we're going to sell, they're all very helpful. Enough for us to come back to you with another presentation and
over.
discussion. And we will strive to do that January. We'll talk about the timing, so it's Jan, maybe Feb.
Right.
Get it back.
And we'll get a little better assessment about the appetite for nuclear between amongst the other CCAs too, because I really don't
That would
know.
be- Yeah.
Could I just ask one thing?
Sure.
So, if I understand how this is framed from slide 9, at the current, and maybe it'd be helpful to get a little more guidance from the board about this. I mean, in the rightmost two columns on slide 9, if you can bring that one up.
It's a, I have it.
Can we
You
go
could
to
bring the
slide?
presentation up, please.
Yes, on the presentation slide.
Thank you. So what we're talking about here is a relatively small difference of $500,000 this year if we go to a lower RPS as to whether we dump all the nuclear, which is sell the large hydro and basically keep the nuclear in that case.
Mhm.
And if we sell the nuclear, we lose and keep the large hydro, we're out from the best performing scenario by $500,000. Correct? Then if we move to 50-50, the yellow two columns, actually the difference is much larger, the 6.7 to 11.4. Is that correct?
Correct.
So I mean, I've expressed myself, and I won't do it again except to say, I don't really have a problem with the nuclear, but it sounds like a lot of my colleagues do. The bigger difference we might consider, right, is if we have to, as Margaret said, right, if we have to express our values, and carbon-free seems to be a consensus position, would you rather maintain the current RPS level, or would you rather accept the nuclear if we get into a scenario where we, think it would be prudent to hold the money? I'd be prepared to make a motion on any of it, but if we're going to go do this in January, that's fine too. But it might be helpful to hear a little bit more from other directors about, Yeah, what's the next thing that you would hold on to? Do you want to be nuclear free, or are you willing to sacrifice RPS? That might help staff come back to us with an effective recommendation in January.
Did you have a comment?
I'm okay.
Yes, Vice Chair. Oh,
Just to answer your question, 100%, we got to be carbon free. We all agree with that. You know, Courtney made the comment about, you know, we should be probably a little bit more flexible with RPS than we have been, because I know getting those last 2% drives Monica nuts. And it's not good for our bottom line. If we were a little bit more flexible with RPS, I would be comfortable. I would be uncomfortable being right at the minimum. And recognize, you know, think of the way we buy power. We're pretty close for 2020. We don't have all of it for 2021. We're even farther away for 2022. And those numbers, the RPS numbers, are going up. So this is it is a one-time shot. We're selling the tea set. We're keeping the dinner plates. There isn't any more after that. You know what I'm saying? This is not an we're not going to have that every single year because we haven't even bought it yet. But back to your question. So I could see some flexibility on RPS, but not all the way down to the minimum. I don't think that's a place we want to be. And then on the nuclear side, if I had it in my perfect world, I would love to not have to explain to the 5 or 10 people in my city that are upset about nuclear. If there was a way, but I put it in that order. Carbon free, maybe some flexibility on the RPS, and then the nuclear. I get that we could save some money, but again, we're not talking about us sitting at zero. We're talking about we were 45 million net positive, and now we're 30 million net positive. So do we really need to squeeze another 10 million off of it at that point? So that's my order in answer to your question, Ron.
Director Beltran, thanks for your patience.
Thank you. I just wanted to share, really, it's more of a comment and a thought than anything else, is I haven't heard much of the dialogue that you had. But one thing that, as I was going through this learning process, was if we take the nuclear and we use the nuclear, we aren't providing that demand for hydro that we will need to build up and that will become reality when Mount Diablo goes off. And so that's something that I think about, I guess, very much on the lines of what you're saying.
Director Cargan?
So I do recognize the need to move on to other topics, but I'm also understanding I probably won't be sitting here in January. It's not, that my alternate and I are going to flip places, and this will be his vote and his decision. But I do think we've had a substantive discussion up here tonight, and to me, it does seem like, despite the fact that it sounds like there is some confusion, to me, it sounds like there's actually a lot of consensus here, that there is a fair amount of agreement about taking the allocation first and foremost, and then secondly, about what we do with it. And the majority of people, as I've been sort of keeping a tally, are in agreement that the staff should have some flexibility here. Now, what that number may be is another policy discussion, but I'd like to urge you all to consider moving this forward with enough direction tonight that you can not spend January talking about it again. So it seems to me like if you separate out the two items and you say, should we take it? And that's the first kind of round here, I think you're going to have a sense of where the group stands. And then once that vote is taken, then you can get some clarity about where you go with the second one. That would be my suggestion.
I guess I agree that we did have, but as we started talking about the nuclear piece, I just didn't think we had consensus anymore. So, and we can just take a up and down vote and see where we are, if that's what is the preference of the board.
Let me ask just one quick question. When do we have to indicate what we're taking or whether we're taking? Since the earliest they could vote was February.
The earliest would be sometime in March when PG&E has everything approved. They've started the process on December 2nd by putting in a filing with the PUC, and there's several steps that have to be completed. We think the earliest would be sometime in March.
So
end
we
of
as,
March.
we as a body don't have to decide definitively. The flexibility that it sounds like Monica needs is, can she start talking to the other CCAs tomorrow to figure out what we want to get rid of? That's
Right.
the real decision you need tonight.
Right, and if we found a counterpart who'd be willing to take our share of the nuclear, then they would avoid buying something else on the market, and so it's kind of a.
So that's the
Yeah.
interesting thing.
I think
If we're not making the definitive decision tonight, if we're giving you the indication we would take the nuclear, but only if you could get rid of it, then I think everybody would say, oh, we're happy. And you
Sure.
would have what you need to go ask other people. And if you come back in January and say, we're never getting rid of this nuclear if you take it,
Then
we can have a harder
reconsider.
discussion about whether we want to take it.
I would only, I would only add, though, that you're straddling your next board meeting across Christmas, New Year's, and
It doesn't even have
the
to be.
fact that other CCAs may not be having the same exact discussion on our timeline. So I think what
But
makes
again,
more
we don't-
sense
we
here,
don't have-
Howard, is to take your straw poll, figure out if the group is in agreement that we should take the allocation, which, by the way, as I understand it, is not mean Monica has to say yes unless it makes sense when it comes across your desk. You
Then how-
still may look at it and go, wow, this just doesn't make sense from the direction I've heard it. You're not bound to
Well,
take it.
then how about a motion
You
that's-
have the right to
You
take it.
could,
Then-
you
then-
could
Well,
distinguish taking.
May I interrupt? Sorry.
Yes.
This is
Dr.
Liz.
Gibbons.
Staff has already said they have enough information. So I'm not sure why we need to vote on anything.
Well, so, I mean, I'll entertain a motion. I think we could
There
distinguish
is one
the
that
motion
is
that
possible
says.
that says, why don't we direct staff to, if with absent any other discussion, take the allocation if they're absolutely certain they can get rid of the nuclear.
That's, yeah, that was my.
So then what are the penalties if staff says yes tonight but can't get rid of it in
Then they
June?
come
Are you going
back
to
to
fire
us.
somebody? What are you going to do here?
No, they come back to us.
Again, my point is that what they want to do is be able to talk to the other CCAs, get a
Mhm.
feel if they can come back, because we don't have to decide this. We don't have to decide if we're buying. If staff can buy it and get rid of the nuclear, they never have to see us again.
Do you
If
think
they
you'll
can't-
have some
If they
kind
can't
of
get rid of the nuclear, they should
indication
see
in
us
the
before
next
they
month
commit.
or so that this could come back to us with a better sense of?
Not by January.
Not by January, no.
No.
Yeah,
So tonight, you think we need to decide?
Yeah,
Take the full
Well, look,
allocation or
we've
not?
had two
I
workshops
think-
on this over the last two meetings.
Okay,
I mean, we
well-
could sit here in indecision. When we get new board members in,
and,
we're
you
going to
know,
have a lot more of it.
It's, yeah, we can take I'm happy to
I-
entertain a motion, and if you
Yeah,
want to just vote.
I'm going to go ahead and make a
let's just
motion.
vote, yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and make a motion. We direct the staff to go ahead and take the allocation in full, and then come back to us at the next convenient time as to what the options are as far as what should be sold or not sold, what percentages.
I'll second that.
Right, so there's a motion by Director
So I didn't hear the
Lafayette.
end of his motion. Can you clarify what the end was? I heard the first part, but I didn't hear the end of it.
Somebody can repeat it on staff? What the
His
motion was?
motion is to accept the allocation, but to come back to us with all of our options when they become clear and present.
Thank you.
I would move that we direct staff.
There's a
Well, no,
there's a motion
there's a
right now
second.
before.
We have a motion and a second, but are we not allowed by our rules an alternate
do
motion
an
if I can
alternate
get a
You
second?
can do an
for it?
alternative motion if that's the intent.
Which is what I'm attempting to do.
All right.
My alternate motion would be that we direct staff to only accept the allocation if they have a plan to get rid of the nuclear.
I would second that.
So now how we're going to vote?
So we
Well, you have to vote on the
alternate
alternative,
motion
need to
first.
vote on the alternative motion first. If that passes, that's it, but if it fails, you go
Then
back
we
to the
go
other
back
motion.
the old motion. So is there any more discussion on the alternate motion to accept the allocation only if we can get rid of the nuclear?
Can I
Yes.
clarify something before I vote on the alternate motion? Does staff believe it could come back to us in January with some indication of whether or not they can sell the nuclear? Because then we could always make another motion, because we still have time in the timeline that I've heard. So I am open to supporting.
Not a definitive indication.
But some
We
indication
can get
from-
some kind of
some
sense of who
sense,
might
yeah.
be willing to buy it.
Okay.
And what it might be worth to them, but it's not a guarantee, again, until we have a contract with that counterparty.
And I'll also say, if I may add to what Monica said, Yeah, obviously, when we have a contract and all that. But many of us are going through these discussions right now. I would say in February, we'll have a better sense because most folks would have gone to their board December and January. Our first meeting is January 8th. But we can talk to staff, but they wouldn't have had the benefit of having the board discussions.
Again, when do we actually have to make the decision as to what we're taking?
Not until March,
At the
April.
earliest, okay.
Yeah.
February. All right, any other discussion on the alternate motion, which is to take the allocation only if we can offload the nuclear? All right?
So what happened to the?
With certainty. I seconded it. It was a motion, alternate motion by Vice Chair. So, all right, all those in favor?
Need a roll call.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, roll call, please.
Yes, thank you. Director Gibbons, we'll start with you. Your vote, please.
Yes.
Thank you. Director Montano?
No.
Thank you. Director Elahi?
No.
Thank you. Director Sayak?
Yes.
Director Smith?
Yes.
Director Sinks?
No.
Director Corrigan?
No.
Chair Abekoga?
Aye.
Vice Chair Miller?
Aye.
Alternate Director Flagger?
Yes.
Director Ellenberg?
No.
Director Martinez Beltran?
Aye.
Thank you.
No, it passed.
It passed.
Yes, the motion carries.
It carries.
Motion carries. I counted 7 to 5.
Yep.
Correct.
So, all right.
Okay.
Thank you for a very in-depth discussion, and it's a difficult issue. So, I think that's all we'll probably have the bandwidth for tonight. But thank you for the discussion. So, all right, we can move on now. I hope the other items are a little more quicker. Item 4, the contract extension with Calpine. I have Director of Account Services and Community Relations, Don Bray. Welcome to the stage.
All right, thank you, Chair, and good evening, directors. Yes, we are going to descend from the strategic into the tactical. I think you'll find this refreshing, and it should be relatively quick. We've had Calpine under contract for the last 3 years, providing us with data management services. And what that means is they provide all of our billing and financial transaction processing work for us behind the scenes. It's a big contract. It amounts to about $3.5 million a year that we pay them. Their contract is up in June of 2020, and we need to inform them by the end of this month is what we intend to do. Our options were basically to extend the contract for a year, and this provision was in the current contract. We'd pay an additional 3% or so under that scenario. Another option was to open it up for bid and look to other players in the market and see if we could get a better price. A third option still was to go back to them and see if we could exchange a longer term, the prospect of a longer term agreement for some sort of price reduction. And it turned out that Peninsula Clean Energy was in exactly the same position with where their contract was. So we decided to work together on this. We approached Calpine late summer, had several different discussions with them, and ultimately they came back to us with a proposal for a 5-year extension with a 3-year out clause that gave us a pretty substantial price reduction, actually. So we're looking at, over the 5-year term, about a 17% reduction from what we would have paid starting next year. And that's a flat rate, so no inflation or anything over those 5 years. There was a fair amount to the conversation with them, of course, but the bottom line is it's basically the same set of services they've provided with some additional support, actually, in terms of some of the detailed analytics that they'll provide us with. We're going to share our call center support service with San Jose and with Peninsula, and that gives us some economies that factored into this. It was a relatively small economy, but one nonetheless. So the net result of all of this is we're looking at establishing a 5-year agreement with them without clauses at 3 and 4 years. That'll result in about depending on whether it's 3 to 5, a 14 to 17% cost reduction. So that'll save us about $500,000 a year off of that $3.5 million. So full contract value for 5 years is about $15 million. So if there are any questions, here to take them. Otherwise, we're looking for approval of this extension.
Thank you. We do have questions from Director Ellenberg and then Director Sings.
Not a question.
Oh.
I would move approval as requested.
I need to take public input first, so are there questions?
Yeah.
Yes, we'll go, and then I'll come back to you for the motion, yes.
So in reading this, I noticed on the soft copy of our packet, page 144, that it looks like we're getting more granular data in time, or am I misunderstanding? It said support for management of hourly and 15-minute interval customer usage data. Do we have access to that kind of data today?
Yes. And when we began our agreement with them 3 years ago, we didn't have that
Yeah. So I did remember.
Yeah.
So we're now getting the kind of data that we need for programs and other things.
Yes.
To support demand side management and this sort of thing. So I'm supportive of this, and I'm glad to know that we got that improvement.
Great. Any other questions? Director Gibbons, do you have any questions?
No, thank you.
Great. If we're not, we will open up to public comment. Any members of the public wishing to speak on this item? No cards? Great. All right, I'll bring it back to the board, and we did have a motion by Director Ellenberg.
Second.
Any other discussion on the item?
So I'm glad that they reduced, they have a reduction here, so that's a good thing.
Great.
Positive.
Great. And we'll take a roll call vote then, please.
Yes, thank you. Director Gibbons, your vote on this item, please.
Aye.
Thank you. Director Martinez-Beltran? Thank you. Director Ellenberg?
Aye.
Alternate Director Flagger?
Yes.
Vice Chair Miller? Chair Abakoga?
Aye.
Director Corrigan?
Yes.
Director Sinks?
Aye.
Director Smith?
Aye.
Director Sayak?
Yes.
Director Elahi?
Yes.
Director Montano?
Yes.
Thank you. That motion carries.
Great, thank you. Moving on to item 5, discussion of options for our legislative and regulatory matters. Board input. We have our CEO again.
Yeah. Several months ago, a member of our board asked me to look into the ad hoc legislative committee because it basically was reconstituted each year, and it started to look more like a Brown Act committee. So our general counsel, Greg Stepanisic, and I worked on coming up with some alternatives. So let me start by saying all of you as a Brown Act committee provide us strategic feedback by discussing and adopting the legislative platform. Secondly, on a monthly basis, you also provide and have the opportunity to provide strategic advice and reaction through a Brown Act committee on a monthly basis through the CEO report. The one thing that we would miss is that bouncing ideas off, getting quick responses from an ad hoc committee. So we've been advised by General Counsel that in order to keep the ad hoc committee being non-Brown Act, we would have to have the board direct the ad hoc committee to focus on maybe 3 to 5 different priorities. It can't be open-ended. We would also have to have a sunset date, and the suggestion would be the end of this legislative session. There is another option, which is similar to the Risk Oversight Committee, having a committee being appointed by the CEO. My preference would be to have the board set some priorities and create a kind of limited ad hoc committee. It's up to you to decide what you want to do.
Great, thank you. Any questions? No? All right, we'll move on to public comment. Any members of the public wishing to speak on this item? Nope. We'll bring it back to the board for discussion then. Yes, Vice Chair.
You know, this is one of our more valuable committees, and keeping it in its ad hoc form is super important. So if the correct way to structure it is the board has to give 3 or 5 focus areas, we certainly can do it. And if I have it right, we can change those focus areas as the year unfolds. So that just seems like a perfectly reasonable way to go forward. And we'll just see what happens.
As chair of the Ledge Committee, I agree with you.
Yeah, I was hoping you would know what we were doing. So, because we have to make a motion, so
Yeah,
really that's what I'm saying.
Director Carden, do you have a comment? Oh, okay. Any other comments? I will entertain a motion.
Oh, okay. I would propose we choose the first of these options to have the board set priorities on a periodic basis and nominally, unless we decide otherwise, have it run from commencement now, I guess, or at our next meeting until
January to January?
No,
until the end of the ledge session.
The end of the
with
legislative session.
Oh, perfect.
End of the legislative session, and I think then we also have to give direction to this Ledge Committee at our board meeting in January. Or?
What I'd do, if that's the direction you provide, in January, we'll bring back some priorities, and you decide on those priorities, and then in February is when you appoint that ad hoc Ledge Committee. That's the schedule we have for elections.
Okay.
So I second that motion and all the clarification.
Okay. Any other discussion on the motion? By Director Sinks and second by Vice Chair. All right, all those in favor?
We need a roll call.
Oh, I'm sorry. You keep forgetting roll call, please.
Director Gibbons?
Aye.
Thank you. Director Martinez Beltran?
Aye.
Director Ellenberg?
Aye.
Alternate Director Flagger?
Yes.
Vice Chair Miller?
Aye.
Chair Ibakoga?
Aye.
Director Corrigan?
Aye.
Director Sinks?
Aye.
Director Smith?
Aye.
Director Sayat?
Aye.
Director Elahi?
Aye.
Director Montano? Thank you. The motion carries.
Great, thank you. Moving on to item 6. Discussion on succession planning. CEO,
Yes.
start us off again.
So several times over the last year, members of the board have discussed succession planning of the board. We have several charter members of the board who were involved in formation and been here a lot of years, and even others who have been here and got a lot of technical expertise. Many will be leaving in the end of 2020. So we wanted to tee up a discussion as to how do we get board succession planning in place so that so that we can have that knowledge transfer happen effectively. There's also another issue. One thing that we've all seen is our business continues to become more complex. So what the decisions that you are facing in your first year versus the policy decisions you're facing now, they're getting to be a lot more technical, complex, intertwined. So how do we make sure that you as a governing board are educated enough so that you can carry out your responsibilities well? So we wanted to have a discussion. We've put together some best practices in the staff report, but we wanted to gather your comments, your ideas, and then we'll bring it back to you maybe in February. Some of these ideas may be easily implementable immediately. Others may require changes to our bylaws or the charter or the JPA. So we are open to any ideas, and this is for you to discuss and provide us.
Great, thank you.
Alternatives.
Any questions? Yes, Director Montano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I serve on the BASCWA, Bay Area Water
Yes.
Conservation Services Agency. And they had the same dilemma where a lot of institutionalized knowledge, some of these council members were retired, their term was up. So what they did, they changed their bylaws to that even though a council member is no longer a council member, they are still part of that team, because it was to preserve that knowledge. So perhaps looking into that as a model, and then if we have to change our charter, we should do that as well, or look into that. So just some thoughts. Because it is important to have all that knowledge, because, you know,
Absolutely.
for me, I'm new and I'm still learning, so, and a lot of you have been there for a while, so you have that. It's really valuable, so, to have that knowledge.
Thank you. Director Beltran, did you have questions? Oh, I thought I saw.
One has just popped up. Do we have an estimate of how many members we will possibly not return? Are you talking half the board? Are we talking?
I think
I
currently
think we have, yeah.
it's yearly, so it's really dependent on each council and how they choose the members, so there's really no guarantee. And yes.
Rod and Howard are here through December 2020, right? Yeah, but Courtney. Courtney's termed out tonight.
I'm switching with my alternate.
With George.
Yeah, but Courtney's doing that controlled transition.
Right.
George has been here for years, and they're gonna-
Yes.
You're in good hands with George.
Yes. But
and Courtney's going to say.
And I'll serve as his alternate for my remaining year on council so that I can support him if he needs any support back in the hills, and he'll be raring to go. when I'm
And Los
done.
Altos is doing the same thing, so I become the primary in January, but Jeannie will be the alternate.
If I may, I forgot to mention this in my opening remarks, but your question sparked it. Another issue that has been brought up by several board members is sometimes this turnover, because pretty much all of your council supervisors gets to appoint someone each year.
Yes.
And as we get to be we're getting more complex, is that that's a question that I've heard from board members. Are we sure that that's what we want for an agency of this size and complexity? Are there
Yes.
other things we should be considering?
Yeah. So, Dr. Elahi? Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I think those are important concerns. And asking two-year appointments is probably not a bad idea. If we can ask each council to maybe adopt an ordinance or a resolution of some sort that allows that. I do think that you do want the cities involved, so that if a person is no longer a council, they should not be on this board. And the reason is what we're doing is we are looking at cities to complement what we do. For example, in the REACH codes, it helped that, that we are on this board so that we could go back to our city council, we understand what's going on, and explain the depth and the breadth of the REACH codes, and push that through. So I think that helps to have the city councils directly involved. So we do need to go there, because as earlier was mentioned, people don't even know what Silicon Valley Clean Energy is. And while I was supporting that on Montecito City Council, one of the person objected to me and told me I had a conflict because I was also sitting on this board. So they really don't understand what's going on.
So it looks like we're going into discussion, so before we do that, I'd like to open up to public comment. Any members of the public wishing to speak on this item? Nope. All right, I'll bring it back. And Director Gibbons, do you have any comments?
She is no longer in the meeting.
Okay. All right, great. Any other comments? I agree. I actually went back and looked, and our council did implement a 2-year term for the seat. The mayor chooses, and I think I'll be mayor next year, so I'm planning to continue. But I like at VTA's 2-year terms. I'm on the Air District Board. I believe it's 3-year terms, and I think some of these boards that are a little more technical can definitely use longer terms. So I would recommend that we look at our bylaws and changing the bylaws to make it 2-year terms, and then that would then trigger the city councils to make those
Can we ask
changes.
Greg just a quick question? There's like sort of our operating norms, but isn't this part of how we were chartered, and wouldn't each city have to ratify the amendment?
No, not the way the agreement is set up. So
Okay.
the board itself can, by 2/3 vote, can amend the JPA agreement without going back to the individual cities and the county.
Great.
So if you would desire, right now, as you know, there's no term, there's no specification of the term of the appointments. It's up to each council and to the Board of Supervisors, but you could make that as an amendment if that was directed by the board.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Right. Yes, Director Sinks.
Well, first thing is, I think those of us with experience, I mean, yeah, Howard and I are going to be around for one more year. Were we to suddenly institute a policy to say you have to be able to serve for 2 years, the appointments are for 2 years, I guess that'd knock us off. So I think a modification of that could be, right, somebody who's not had served before. And that could make some sense. So if you're making a new appointment, it's a 2-year thing. So the other thing is, though, in order to set this up at 2 years, I would feel somewhat uncomfortable trying to make that decision without conferring with my counsel. So even though maybe I'm empowered to do that, you say the agreement allows for us to do that, I'd probably want to go back and have that discussion with my counsel to be able to take a vote. And we're queued up only for discussion
Yes.
tonight, but what I'm saying is before we bring that, I'd want to have that discussion with the mayor, if not the council, and see if, we can get some consensus and explain for all the right reasons that everybody's enumerated here why, right? We're a $250 million a year business operating in the public interest, and there's a lot to know. It's incredible, and it is comparable to the Air District, which is 3 to 4, I guess. So, thanks.
So it is just a discussion item this evening. Do you think we can bring it back in January or February? And then by then, maybe we can have our conversations with our councils? Would be the preference of staff?
There's no big rush on this. The idea here is just to try and get as many ideas as possible.
Oh, okay.
Because this is kind of the board's responsibility. So I'm just looking for ideas from you, and then we'll bring it back in February.
Okay, Director Beltran and then Vice Chair.
One, I just wanted to Rod's comment. Would those who are serving now and have a small amount of time left, would they not just be able to serve the remainder of their time?
Sure.
Being grandfathered, as I'm hearing over
Yes,
here.
That's not an issue.
Okay, so that wouldn't be an issue.
I mean, my point was more that, not just for us, but let's say that for whatever reason things change, I'd still, if it wasn't me, I'd still at some future time want to allow somebody with experience to serve a year as opposed to, let's say that it's 4 years from now and my successor may be termed out or whatever. I'd still want to have somebody, I'd prefer to have somebody with experience. That's my only point. It's not about who's up here.
I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're...
Let's say we had somebody that served for whatever reason on this institution the next 3 years, on this board the next 3 years.
Okay.
That person might be termed out then. Would you rather have that, this isn't this year, it's 4 years from now. Would you rather have that person with 3 years of experience serve 1 more year, or would you say, sorry, you're not eligible?
No. But what you can do though is you can just have 2-year terms, but no limit on the number of terms.
No term limits.
So someone could serve consecutive 2-year terms.
So if I knew I wasn't, if my city knew, I knew I wasn't going to be around for 2 years.
Yeah. This is, if I may say so, it's a bit of a non-issue.
Yeah. Okay.
So I would say, as part of this discussion, that's grandfathering. We can
Yes,
deal with
yeah,
it.
yes.
I'm actually looking for bigger ideas
Okay.
in addition
Yes.
to what you've said. For example,
I got another idea.
4 or 5 years from now, I think you've all served on boards, whether it's a hospital board, elected boards, where at some point, how do you want to structure us? Because we're dealing with big dollar decisions. Are there ideas that you have where you can say, okay, these things are so technical, maybe I want to set up a technical board and I'm going to delegate authority to that board to do certain things. I'm not really, having an advisory commission's not necessarily where I think we want to go. But those are the bigger things. Think 5 years from now, what do you want to be looking at? And if I may add also, all these ideas are a bit of brainstorming from you as a board, and I'll bring this back to the executive committee hash this out some more, bring it back. There's no urgency to do this month or next, but it's an important issue that you've asked me to deal with, so we should keep it moving.
Yes, Director Stamp.
I'll make this brief. As part of your consideration with your own team, if you could look at models that incorporate staff. If we're looking at long-term longevity, I think having staff knowledge part and weaved into what your team is doing, I think would be vital. And so whether it's a technical committee, whether it's a staff person being able to sit in these chairs, if the mayor chooses a staff person, I think that ability would be valuable as well.
Thank you. Vice Chair?
Just totally unrelated, but related, including the alternates. At VTA, when they do a study session, all the alternates get a seat at the table. They're all part of the discussion. And I think for all of our training and our study sessions, we should go out of our way to invite and encourage the participation of our alternates, just as a way to foster the training and the development.
I agree. Yes, Director Smith.
This, as you say, the experience that you bring to this board only accumulates, and it is a very specialized set of knowledge. It is getting more and more technical. Has staff, or would this board consider looking at a directly elected board?
Go ahead, yes.
We don't have to decide anything
Yeah,
today.
we're
I
just
think that's great.
brainstorming this evening.
Because
so,
that, you know.
Yeah. We can definitely put that on the list. I
It's
think we're
a-
just brainstorming
Yeah.
and this will come back.
So let's
for
put that on
further
the list. It would, I guess,
Yep.
what would it take? Would it be a special district? Would it, you know, like what?
Sure.
What would the process be kind of as an option? Because that's certainly one way to get the attention of qualified people. So.
My gosh. Yes or no? Vice Chair, did you have a? Oh, did you? Okay.
So another one.
Director-
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. We'll go to Director Boston.
The other part that I had forgot was just exactly that, if the alternates could be staff.
That's
I think you mentioned that.
Director Montana?
Yeah, so I also serve on the first five, as well as Susan as well, on the board. So we were appointed by I was appointed by our Board of Supervisors, but I've been there for 10 years, so perhaps something like that. And it is very beneficial because we have that institutional knowledge that really helps the board move forward, the first five move forward, so you might want to think about that as well. I don't know, just throwing some ideas out
Yeah,
there.
that's what we're here for tonight. So thank you. And Director Smith again, and then Director Elahi.
So to staff's question about the technical advisory board, I know, I guess the question would be if staff has any recommendations about what could be delegated to a technical advisory board to make that analysis of technical decisions more palatable to the electeds who serve if we keep a structure similar. So I think it would be helpful to have some idea of what sorts of things could be delegated to another body or two. And if so, what would be the charter? What would be the limits? What would be the terms, performance measures, that sort of thing of such a body?
Director Elahi?
Yeah, I think we are having a good discussion, but it's probably in the future this discussion will be more valuable. Silicon Valley, this board works very well, the staff works very well, and nothing is broken that needs to be fixed right now. I mean, there's a couple of issues, whether 1 year or 2 year term, and that may be a good issue. But we should, a more heavy duty discussion with maybe an ad hoc committee being appointed to really look at things, to fix if something really needs fixing. Right now, there is an issue of a 1 year term, It's taken me 1 year to make a motion, which I lost, but from that perspective, yeah, 2-year term would be better.
That's right, 2-year terms
so I
would
can
be
see
better.
that. It didn't even get to a vote, but yeah, next year. See, I got outmaneuvered there, but thank you.
Is that enough brainstorming?
Yes, thank you.
Right. And then we'll probably bring this back in February or
February,
so.
March,
I do, I guess I would like to move, though, at least on the 2-year, or a longer term for the board, I think is important. And so
Yeah, that for
even
sure.
as we start have new members coming in, we might want to set that, or have that discussion and decide on
Okay,
a longer
I'll bring
term
this back
than that.
to the executive committee.
Okay.
And then I think we can move forward with some of them, and I think some of them are definitely going to be quite long-term.
Great.
Thank you very
All right,
much.
thank you. All right, we have a few more items. Item 7, we have the executive committee report from Vice Chair Miller.
So first, for those who are following along at home, the power just went out in Saratoga. According to PG&E, it'll be restored at 12:30.
Oh, my goodness.
So not a planned power outage.
Oh.
It's their reliable grid, Rod. Don't worry. They have gas, though. So we did meet on November 22nd. We did get an update on the REACH code adoption, which we were super excited about and positive. We talked a bit about power prepay, which is a complicated financial transaction which allows us to use our municipal status to have an agency issue debt on our behalf to prepay for our power so we can get everything at a discount. Interesting thing, we're going to get more information on that. We talked about the great PCIA news that we got tonight, the bearer of bad news, sorry, and the PG&E generation rates, and we talked a lot more about the numbers and how it would impact us. And I know we're all going to get a much more in-depth update as that comes forward early next year. And then staff went through some of the benefits and other programs that are being changed around wellness for our employees. It's all good stuff, and some of it's super logical. The employees don't like one provider for the health savings account, so they found a different one. So it's things like that. I'm just happy that staff continues to do all the good stuff. Our leadership is doing all the good stuff to try and keep our staff happy. And then we are tentatively scheduled to meet again on January 31st.
Thank you. Any questions for the vice chair from the board? If not, I'll open up to public comment. Any members of the public wishing to speak on this item? If not, I'll bring it back. Any other discussion? Not, thank you. And we'll move on to item 8, the audit committee report by Director Corrigan.
The audit committee met on December the 4th and kicked off our financial audit with independent auditor Pizzinti and Brinker, who we've used before, and received an update from staff on cybersecurity risk assessment and mitigation strategies that was incredibly informative and frightening. The next meeting of the group will be January 27th, 2020 at 1 p.m. in the SBCE offices.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions for Director Corrigan?
Can you
Yes.
say something about frightening?
Just the enormous amount of energy and work that goes into preserving the security around our own data, our equipment, our software and hardware, and then the security that goes into protecting the data of our customers and any vendors that we're doing contracts with, et cetera, et cetera.
I guess, is there any reason for the board in general to hear more about this or to be frightened, or do you think?
No. I mean, just,
Okay.
it's just, as a layperson, it's sort of overwhelming when you realize what risks are
How big a
out
deal
there.
this is.
While we were in the meeting, somebody in the group shared that they had just gotten a phishing email that was so realistic that they came very close to falling for it. Let's just say it was a very common experience in the room.
Baltimore spent over a year and $20 million recovering their IT infrastructure after they got hit.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah. All right. Any members of the public wishing to speak on this item? If not, thank you very much, Director Corrigan. So we're going to move on to board member announcements and direction on future agenda items. Are there any announcements from board members?
Well,
Yes, Director
I'll just say
Sands.
briefly that members of the former Ledge Committee, maybe we still are, through the end of the year, say, and I know other board members would be invited as we go visit our legislators. And so Hillary has set this up. We're visiting Assemblymember Evan Lowe's office tomorrow, and Mark Stone, and we're visiting Berman, right? So,
And Canson, too.
so you know, please take a look at these emails and consider whether or not you can come and help, you know, have a discussion prior to the beginning of session.
Thank you. Any other announcements? Yes.
I'd just
Dr.
like to
Corrigan.
share that the town of Los Altos Hills did pass our REACH codes. They were sort of a modified version. We didn't outright ban gas, but we did require that all new construction have the option for gas or full electrification in the kitchens and in laundry rooms, and that the use of fireplaces would still be permitted. But we really got underway because of the emphatic and enthusiastic comments by my fellow council member and your next director, George Tyson, who's here tonight. And I just want to thank him for taking such a strong stance so publicly in Los Altos Hills and smoothing the way to get this thing passed in our town. So thank you, George.
Thank you, George. And congratulations, Los Altos Hills. Let's see, who that, Director Sayoc, yes.
So because of that, Los Gatos had our first reading, and we not only heard the agenda item, we did pass first reading, so we are banning natural gas for all residential, and asked for pre-wiring of battery storage and a second EV. Second reading, it will be Tuesday, and I don't suspect any problems. We did have our transition, so our new mayor is Marcia Jensen, vice mayor is Barbara Spector. We believe we may be under more transitions as another council member may be residing soon. So because of that, we're going to be allocating workload differently, and I'm not sure. Rob Rennie and I may be switching so that he will be the director and I'll be the alternate. So we'll see, depending on workload changes. So.
Great, thank you. I have Dr. Smith and then Director Lahi.
Thank you. I would like to acknowledge some of my colleagues on this board, Rico, and I don't know if anybody else was there, but last week, the league leaders met in Napa for the League of California Cities to set priorities for fiscal year 2020. And I would like to read verbatim, it takes a couple seconds, that we added climate change as a priority. So it's priority number 4. They're not ranked in any particular order, but it was very high up there. It was very important to the people who attended the league leaders meeting. So the item is to strengthen community and disaster preparedness, public safety, and resiliency. Improve community resiliency to disasters and environmental threats, and strengthen infrastructure stability and control through expanding partnerships, including state and federal agencies, and securing additional resources and support for climate change adaptation, planning, preparedness, response, recovery, and sustainability in our cities. So it was a big deal that the term climate change was included. So thanks to my colleagues on the board.
Great, thank you. Director Lahi.
So update on Montesano, yeah, we passed the REACH codes at our second reading also. And our REACH codes don't ban gas, but they require pre-wiring for all appliances, and also require 2 EVs. So that passed. Also, we have a new mayor, Liz Lawler is going to be the mayor. She's an alternate on this board. She's indicated that I can continue to serve for this year, and she'll continue to be, I will be an alternate. Well, that might change. It's Montessori now, so.
Thank you. Thank you for your service. So I think you all have a copy of our update on REACH codes, and these boxes are getting checked, which is very exciting. So congratulations, and thank you to all of you for your leadership in your respective communities on that. Was there, did I see another hand up? Oh, yes, Director Smith.
The Peninsula Division of the League of California Cities is planning for our third quarter meeting to focus on CCAs and sustainability.
Right. And I want to also thank staff for all of your support in getting these REACH codes passed in our communities. So let's see, I do have an announcement or just a reminder. Any of you directors interested in the chair or vice chair and or executive committee membership, your letters of interest are due by December 19th, which is next Thursday. And then at your seats, you should see the timeline of our selection of those positions. January 8th at our next meeting, we will make those selections. And then on the 10th, you should be receiving the committee matrix worksheet where you can express your interest in serving on any of the, or whatever community committees you would like to serve other than the executive committee. And that will be due January 31st. And then we will make the assignments at the following board meeting, February 12th. So just a reminder on that. And I just want to, this is my last full meeting as chair, I believe. So I just want to thank you all for a great year. I think we really accomplished quite a bit, probably more than we even expected. I really appreciate all of you, your interest, your commitment. Tonight, we were expecting this to go long this evening, and we had some meaty subjects, and I appreciate all of your participation and hanging in there to the end. But I'm really just very proud of this organization and this board and our top-notch staff. It's really been one of my highlights, and so I just want to thank you all again for a wonderful year.
And we are equally proud of you, Margaret, for serving as our chair.
Well, thank you. So we do have a closed session, and then we need to come back to vote on the item. So if you can all hang in there for maybe another 10 minutes, I'm hoping we can get through this. But I will take public comment on the closed session item. Is there any member of the public wishing to speak on the item? Which is, I guess I should read it. It's conference with real property negotiators. The property is 333 West El Camino Real, Sunnyvale. Agency negotiator Girish Balachandran, CEO. Negotiating parties Newark Knight Frank. Under negotiation, price and terms of payment. And we also have a conference with legal counsel on existing litigation. Government Code Section 54956.9. D, parentheses, D, parentheses, 1, name of case. In regards to PG&E debtor, United States Bankruptcy Court, Northern District of California, San Francisco Division, case number 19-30088. Any members of the public wishing to speak on either of those items? If not, we will convene in the kitchen for a closed session, and we will be back for the vote on one of these items. Thank you. To return to the dais so we can take action on our last item. So we are going back to item 9, which is the authorization of the CEO to negotiate and execute an office lease agreement. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second. Any other discussion?
Check for members of the public.
Yes, well, we did take close, I guess you're right. So any members of the public wishing to speak on this item? If not, I'll bring it back to
Roll call.
the board.
Roll call vote.
Yes.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. We don't need it. Right, that's correct.
Okay.
So we can just do a voice.
Do a vote. Okay,
Yes.
great. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries. Again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Director Corrigan, for your many years of service. We will miss you, but
Happy
please-
holidays, everyone.
And happy holidays, everyone.
Guess what happened? For all my fellow Sharks fans, they fired Pete DeBoer tonight. They fired Pete DeBoer tonight.